I saw you give this amazing presentation about the glorious Austrian Navy and the dreadnoughts of World War One. And I figured, okay, most people, they never heard they had one. And then I hear you talk about what a great one it was. And I figured, you have to tell the story about that. But before, how did you get into, I would say it's a little specific for military history research. How did you find out? How did you, where did that come from?
Well, I'm a member of the Western Front Association here in England, and I give talks. And almost all the talks tend to be about the Western Front. And members are getting tired of all the talks about young officers winning their VCs or whatever, 𝐼𝐸 or SOM or whatever. So I started looking for talks in areas that people didn't. And I thought it just added a dimension to the whole history of the war if you got to see something beyond the Western Front. And somebody a few years asked me, could I do the Austrian-Hungarian army, which I did. So that was the talk on the Austrian-Hungarian army. But my interest is more naval. So I thought, oh, I'll go and have a look at the Austro-Hungarian Navy. And like everybody else, I suspected they didn't really have a navy and it didn't do anything. And then I was completely taken aback by the fact they did have a navy. It was an efficient navy. It was an active navy, a lot more active than most of the Allied navies. I mean, it wasn't the best constructed navy, but what they did with it was, you know, it's the quality of your officers, I suppose, and they did something that the French, the British, and the Germans couldn't do, which is a perfect bombardment.
Take it from the beginning, because I love this story. I mean, all of it actually, because I started my studies was World War II. That's what I wrote my thesis in when I got my degree. And you travel around, write books on World War II, and then eventually that leads me back to World War One and the Prussian-Franco War. But World War One, everybody wants to talk World War II, but World War One is really interesting, and there's so much new development and so much happening. And it's maybe it's because of the memory, maybe it's because World War II is more documented visually. But World War One is fascinating because so much happens, so much new technology is brought to bear for the first time, and now all of a sudden you tell me about the Austro-Hungarian Navy, and then you say dreadnoughts, and now you have my full attention. I mean, the dreadnoughts are awesome.
Yeah, they built four. The Italians built four, so they were matching each other in a little arms race of their own in the Mediterranean. I mean, the Austrian-Hungarian Navy up to 1905 is a small coastal navy of mainly small coastal battleships and a few protected cruisers, although it does have an overseas station, which is 𝐮𝐾𝐿 in China, which they shared with the Germans. Well, the German ship would say it the other way around. But they did have a base there, and they sent cruisers out there during the Boxer Rebellion. They sent about 4 warships out to China. But dismissing them as like a small coastal navy, that was what the German Navy was at the same time. The German Navy was a coastal navy up to about 1904 with practically the same size ships with the same armament, 9.4-inch guns instead of the big 12-inch that dreadnoughts carried, or even British pre-dreadnoughts. But then when the Italians and the Austrians started a naval arms race in the Adriatic over the issue of Albania, because Albania was wanting to become independent from the Ottoman Empire, and the Italians thought it was a good idea as long as it was an Italian province, and the Austro-Hungarians thought it was a good idea as long as it was independent. And so the Italians started to build dreadnoughts, so the Austro-Hungarians responded with building dreadnoughts, and they both built 4 dreadnoughts. The Tetragráf class was the Austro-Hungarian 4 dreadnoughts, very small, compact, but heavily armed. They used triple turrets in order to give 12 12-inch in just 4 turrets, where the British were still using double turrets at the time. Yeah. So they were to have 12 12-inch, you would have had to have 6 turrets on a British. I think the American dreadnoughts carried 6 turrets with 2 12-inch to get the same amount of power. So it was compact, but they could make their ships compact because they weren't going very far. You don't need masses of coal to go around the Adriatic.
So they're designed to only stay in their sphere of influence there.
Yes,
They
they
weren't
were
going to
thinking
sail them
basically
to
Adriatic.
sing.
They were considering the Mediterranean, and they wanted Salonika. When they were took in Bosnia-Herzegovina in 1908, they were thinking of extending their power down to Salonika and make that an Austro-Hungarian port. And so they were looking to some extension to the Mediterranean. But the dreadnoughts were the first. These four dreadnoughts were the first. But they had many others planned, bigger ones planned, including battle cruisers. I think they had 8 dreadnoughts planned by 1920, another 8 therefore. So they were going to have a big navy. So they would become a Mediterranean naval power. The Italians built 4 battle dreadnoughts, but they're better dreadnoughts, much better built. But they did nothing with them. The Adriatic is throughout that war was an Austrian sea. The Italians would not dispute it, even though their dreadnoughts were better.
So were they bigger, heavily armed, or?
They were better constructed. They were about the same armament. They carried triple turrets as well. But they were in. The problem with the Austro-Hungarian dreadnoughts was that they had to save money, and so they had poor underwater protection as a result. But they weren't, and one of them was so badly built that when she was torpedoed, they couldn't close the watertight doors, so she just filled up with water. She didn't sink from the torpedo. She was crippled by the torpedo because of her poor underwater protection. But because the watertight doors hadn't been properly fitted, they just couldn't stop the water spreading through the ship. So she just slowly sank, and turned turtle. It wasn't a quick action, just slowly filled up and tipped over.
So the sailors got off.
Oh yeah, mate, you can see them running along the top of as they got off. It was the reason for that was the Austro-Hungarians navy had a problem. It's that there are 2 budgets. There are 2 governments in the Austro-Hungarian Empire because it's split between the Hungarians and the Austrians.
The dual monarchy.
The dual monarchy. They split the empire, which is what when I was doing this talk on the army, I have to explain. There's a royal kingdom of Hungary, but it's not Hungary. It's also all the southern provinces like Croatia. So Hungary had a coastline, which was Dalmatia. The Austrians would rule the northern provinces up to Galicia and Slovenia, but not Croatia. And only the emperor holds the empire together.
Yeah.
So if you want to pass a budget to build warships, you have to have first the Austrian parliament has to vote for it, then the Hungarian parliament has to vote for it, and then it can go ahead. But if one of those parliaments does not agree to the budget, it stops. And they now have to begin to negotiate. It's very difficult passing a budget in the Austro-Hungarian Empire.
I hear room for pork belly fat, as we'd call it over here.
Well, the Austrians were keen for a navy. The Hungarians are very much more land-based in their attitude. I mean, they created Croatia, but only in 1867. So they're still land-based. And they couldn't see why they should be spending Hungarian money on a navy, which was basically an Austrian navy. So they were very reluctant to spend money. So one of the things that the Austrians did to get these budgets through was that they would name warships after Hungarians could choose a name of a warship. So every 3 warships they built, one of them would be Hungarian named, and the other 2 would be Austrians named. But to get the dreadnoughts through was much more difficult because that was much more expensive. So they agreed that the Austrians could build one of those dreadnoughts. It would not only be named after the patron saint,
the Hungarians,
Saint Stephen, of Hungary, it's Saint Stephen, but it would also be built in Hungary. The problem was that the Hungarians did have a naval yards in Dalmatia, but they only built destroyers, only little boats, nothing as big as a dreadnought. So they didn't build it very well. And that was the ship that sank with the torpedo, the St. Stephen. Because the watertight doors wouldn't fit shut properly.
So did they even have room to lay out the full-length keel, or did they
Oh
piecemeal?
yes, they adapted the naval yard and everything, but they didn't have the skill that you had at Trieste
Yeah.
and Trieste, where the other ships were built. They were better built. Their watertight doors would fit. It's just they lacked the shipbuilding experience to build a dreadnought,
They
a
had
battleship,
Skoda. They had
or even
Skoda
a
back
heavy
at the
cruiser.
time. They could have helped.
Yeah.
Were they not involved? Well, they must have built the guns, surely.
Oh yeah, the guns would be built by Krupp up in Bohemia.
Really? They weren't built by
Oh,
Skoda?
oh no, you're right. Yes, of course. I'm thinking of
Because,
later.
like, I was
Yes,
very,
Skoda. The guns were built up there. No, I was
I was,
referring to the building of the ship itself.
yeah.
I mean, I've seen YouTubes that say that the Austrians lost the St. Stephen because they were all had poor underwater protection. But that's not really what I've investigated. Yes, it was crippled by the torpedo, but it would have got back to port if it'd been at one of its sisters, because it wasn't that crippled that enough. But it just filled up with water. It just
Did
wasn't built.
did anyone dive the wreck since? I don't know how deep it is.
I don't know. I
I'm
have
just,
no idea.
I'm just curious. It'd be like they dive all the other interesting ships. Where this is. So what happened to the other three ships? Since I don't see them in a museum anywhere today, Austria. I
Right.
don't know how they
Well,
would get
the
there.
flagship was the Verbus Unitas. That is the name ship of the squadron. Verbus Unitas is arms, united arms. That's what it means, and it's the
Yes.
personal motto of the emperor. And she was sunk at the end of the war. The Italians, two Italians, had come up with what the Italians are really good at is the particular is human torpedoes. They sunk
Yes.
British battleships in the Second World War the same way,
Yes.
literally riding a torpedo into the harbour, get underneath the ship and attach it to the keel, and then swim away. So that's what they did. They attached it to the Verbus Unitas. That video claimed, well, the Verbus Unitas had poor underwater protection. She couldn't not but sink. But actually, any warship would sink if you put a mine or a torpedo on its keel. It'd break the keel. But the two Italians were captured while trying to get away and brought on board. So they told the commander what they'd done. And so everybody got off. The commander said, okay, there's nothing more we're going to do about this. Let's get off. And so the Austro-Hungarian flagship was sunk, except it wasn't the Austro-Hungarian flagship. That was the thing. Austro-Hungarian Navy had ceased to exist. This was the Yugoslavian flagship.
Oh.
Because as Austro-Hungary disintegrated, it handed its fleet over to Yugoslavia.
Of course,
and
yes.
20 minutes before that, those Italians laid their mine underneath it. The Yugoslavians had taken over the ship, which means that their admiral, their first admiral of the fleet, only had his flagship for a very short period. And it went down flying the Yugoslavian flag, not the Austro-Hungarian flag.
Oh, what a waste.
And there is a conspiracy theory that the Italians knew that, but the Italians were absolutely determined that the new Yugoslavia would not have a navy that could possibly rival the Italians. And they would, when they got to Versailles, they flattered the British, saying you can have the entire Austro-Hungarian navy. So all the powerful warships were given away, and the Yugoslavia was just left with a few old destroyers to form a new navy with, and never would be a rival to the Italians in the Adriatic, as the Austro-Hungarians had been.
I could see that as a very plausible possibility. It's not like certain British prime ministers later on wouldn't leave the French with wonder weapons or anything.
Yeah. That's why I have a sneaking feeling that was the case. The Italians were aware that the Yugoslavians had just acquired the navy. But anyway, they lost two, and the other two were simply taken away by the British to be scrapped, or by the French. They gave them all away and scrapped them, and the entire Austro-Hungarian navy, except for a few ships which were handed over and reused by other navies, was gone.
And of course, from that point on, Austria no longer had any water access. So
No, well, it had monitors. It still has a navy because it's still got monitors on the Danube. But that's it.
Yeah.
That's their navy.
I guess that does count.
The Swiss the same. The Swiss have a navy because they got little gunboats on the Danube. So the Swiss have an army life, but they have a navy life as well. Navy knife as well because they have a navy. That's what I'm told. But yes, 1918, the navy ceased to exist, which is probably why it is. And the only things left, as I said in the talk, that reminds one that they had a navy once is Captain Von Trapp from The Sound of Music.
Yes, he was the captain of. Oh, please.
Who commanded a U-boat, a U-5, built in America. All the early Austrian U-boats were built in America. And he is famous for sinking the French heavy cruiser, the Leon Gambetta, with a huge loss of life, which left him traumatized. As Maria von Trapp said, he was traumatized, had nightmares for the rest of his life because he heard them all go down.
He
couldn't do anything.
He was very poorly portrayed ever since.
Yes,
and
she thought
does
so
not
too.
appear to have been that guy at all.
No, she thought the film did him no justice. Not the man she married.
That would be the right way to put it. Yeah.
But it fitted the story.
Well, you know how Hollywood is when it comes to filmmaking and reality.
But yeah, that's it. So the only thing the Austro-Hungarian Navy is remembered for, if it's any, is The Sound of Music.
So before we even get into what they did, so the Americans sold the Austro-Hungarian U-boats before the war.
Yes. The Austro-Hungarians built the submarines from America. They were mostly Holland type. And they had six small little U-boats from America.
So
the Germans supplied them another 6. The Germans came up. They wanted to buy from Germany. So the Germans built a thing called a small U-boat in parts. So you disassemble it and put it on a train and take it where it was almost like the IKEA U-boat, a flat pack U-boat. So they were sent by train to Trieste to be assembled. It was such a good idea that when the Germans in 1915 wanted to build, they couldn't get access to the channel with their U-boats operating from Germany because it's too far. Yeah. It's as far to the channel as it is to the Irish Sea because Germany is so far up, So they did that with these little boats and they sent them to Flanders and formed a little U-boat fleet there of UB boats, they were called. Although the Germans call them tin tadpoles. They are tiny, about 200 tons. I mean, I've seen a picture of the crew, where you normally think of U-boats up on the conning tower looking through their binoculars with the water. Actually, with the UB boats, they're sitting on it with their legs over the side because there's no room to stand. And they're just sitting over with their legs looking through, with their binoculars. They were that small.
So how many crew?
Oh, about 100, I think. It would be overcrowded. Well, yeah. No, I can't remember actually. No, you're quite right. The problem is warships are so overcrowded anyway. But you knew everybody. They had a bond. And then the Germans sent 6 U-boats all the way around through Gibraltar in 1916 to join the Austrians, U-31 to U-38. And 3 of those would be the most successful U-boats of the war. One would sink 500,000 ships, which is 1/20th of the total sinkings.
Wow.
And the key.
The Italian Navy did not. No. Wasn't. Wow.
The key thing was the base. The base for the U-boat base to operate out of the Adriatic was Katora, which is right at the bottom, just on the border of Montenegro, right at the bottom. Mm-hmm. But if it had been at the Austrians' main base up at Pola near Trieste, they would have been out of range of the Mediterranean.
Yeah.
Now, 𝐾𝐶 should have been taken at the beginning of the war because the French planned to use it as their own base, so they sent their navy in. They also sent big heavy guns up onto the Montenegrin mountain that overlooks 𝐾𝐶, and the Austro-Hungarian navy defeated them, basically.
So we're talking 1914 or
1914, 1915, 1914, before Italy enters the war. I mean, my favorite story is the fact that the French fleet, which is, I don't know, I've forgotten, about 8 battleships, 8 dreadnoughts, and all sorts of stuff. Big, huge fleet. The Austro-Hungarian is tiny in comparison. And that's why when they turned up off 𝐾𝐶, the only thing defending it on the Austrian side was an old cruiser called the 𝐬𝐻𝐾𝐿 and a destroyer. But destroyers are always very fast. So the commander of the 𝐬𝐻𝐾𝐿, he just said to the destroyer, disappear, and he did. And the French had nothing that could chase it, leaving the 𝐬𝐻𝐾𝐿 to hold off the whole of the French fleet. As I say in my talk, it may be no surprise to know that the French sank it. But she fought bravely. But to give you an idea how she was outgunned, she was the nearest she got was 400 yards short of any French ship, because she only had little 4-inch guns, you know, and the French battle dreadnoughts are 12-inch. But she defeated the French fleet because the French just fired everything they got on this cruiser, and there's so many splashes they couldn't see their fall of shot, so they couldn't range find. I mean, he said that half the crew was drowning in the amount of water that was coming down on them because they were just completely in a huge. So the French ships started to move round each other to try and get a better angle so they could see the 𝐬𝐻𝐾𝐿, and they kept ramming each other. So when eventually the 𝐬𝐻𝐾𝐿 was sunk, the French fleet had to return to Malta for repairs because it was in. So it sort of strategically defeated the French. Went off. Now they came back once, but one of the little Austrian U-boats torpedoed the fleet flagship, just damaged it. But the French decided they had enough and refused to enter the Adriatic again.
I mean, it's bad enough that they have to fight their own. Now the U-boats come us along. No, I'm not going to do this.
One French submarine did enter the Adriatic, and it was captured. I forgot to mention in my talk, it was the Maria Curie. But it was then converted into an Austrian U-boat, U-21. And that was a blow to the French because U-21 sunk 221,000 tons of Allied shipping. It was the highest U-boat ace of the Austro-Hungarian Navy. And it was a French U-boat, a French submarine. So that, yeah, I mean, and 𝐾𝐶 was never taken as it should have been. And so it wasn't taken. It became the ideal base for U-boats to operate out of because they only had a short journey to pass through the Otranto Straits into the Mediterranean. And the more they were in the Mediterranean, the better. Now, the Austro-Hungarian Navy wasn't unaggressive. It was very aggressive. It would tow out these U-boats into the Med so that they could have greater
save fuel
time in the Med. So they would tow them out. Well, the British and the French and the Italians built a barrage, like the Dover barrage in the Channel, the Otranto barrage across to stop these submarines going through. The Austro-Hungarian Navy kept attacking it. I mean, what they used were drifters, and you set them across, and on the lookout. I mean, a submarine, a U-boat or a submarine is so vulnerable on the surface. Any boat, no matter how small, if it has a gun on it, can sink it.
Yeah.
So they had drifters, something like 47 to 50 drifters at the time across the Otranto barrage. Well, the Austro-Hungarian destroyers, and they would leave 𝐾𝐶 and attack them with great effect. And I think one of them sunk about 10 in one night and came back. And then the Austrian cruisers came up to back up the destroyers. And eventually the result was the Otranto barrage had to be moved south. And after a major attack on the barrage, the drifters weren't allowed to operate at night, only during the day. So you can guess when the Austro-Hungarian U-boats and the 6 German U-boats passed through the Otranto barrage.
Yeah, I can guess on that. Yeah.
So they thought, well, we just block them in the Adriatic. That's what everybody thinks. They're just blocked and they can't do anything. No, they couldn't block them in the Adriatic. The only thing that would affect them is the range of their own ships. But they certainly but they pushed that Otranto barrage, so it became less and less effective.
And the Italian battleships or dreadnoughts never came out to support.
No. Well, the Italians had a pretty rough time at the hands of the Austrian-Hungarian Navy.
Yeah, you got to talk us through what did all these amazing ships do then?
Which ones?
The Austrian-Hungarians. Our four protagonists here.
Well, I mean, the greatest achievement was on the 24th of May, 1915. Right. Italy declares war on the 24th. The Italian Austro-Hungarian frontier is not defended because the Austrian-Hungarians, Italy is their ally.
Yes.
And also they are busy fighting the Russians out in the Carpathians and Galicia. So there is hardly any defense of that frontier. If the Italians mobilize quickly, they can invade Austro-Hungary fairly easily. Maybe they'll be stopped, but somewhere deep into Austro-Hungarian. They may even be able to get to Vienna, which is not far from the border. But the Austro-Hungarian Navy had planned for this. The commander was Anton Hoss, and he planned that on the 24th, as the war was declared, the following night, the entire Austro-Hungarian Navy put to sea, crossed the Adriatic to the eastern side of Italy. Now, the railway system, because of the Apennines up the middle, run up the east coast to Venice and up to the Austro-Hungarian border.
Yes.
So they attacked the railway system along the east coast, particularly the hub, which was at 𝐵𝐿. That was the major railway hub. They blew up bridges, viaducts. They attacked all the ports from Venice downwards, but the key one was 𝐵𝐿, where most of the navy went. And they didn't use the dreadnoughts.
Oh.
They did. I thought it was extremely clever. They have coastal ships. They can get in close. So why not send the coastal battleships in? If the Italians counterattack, they've got coastal batteries, which they expected the Italians to do, then you would lose a coastal ship. The dreadnoughts would stay out to sea. If needed, they could intervene, or if there wasn't any much resistance, they could come in, and because of their greater range of their guns, could fire from further out. But you don't risk losing an Austrian dreadnought, only coastal battleships in the initial action. Anton Hoss was a man who believed in leading from the front, so he moved his flagship from the dreadnought to one of these small coastal ships. The Habsburg, I think the SMS Habsburg. So he was right there at the front. They realized that they weren't expected because when they arrived at 𝐵𝐿, every light was on. Every light was on. They looked like 𝐵𝐿 was having a party, maybe sort of like we're at war party, and they don't know. But they decided to give a warning. The Germans never did this, neither did the British, but they decided to give a warning by an initial attack. They sent 2 destroyers into the harbour, and they launched torpedoes. One would sink a freighter, and the other would sink the pier. Oh. Must be the only pier to be sunk by a torpedo. It missed and it hit the pier and sunk it.
Okay, well, it had it.
Then the 2 destroyers backed out, and they waited 8 minutes, and then they opened up.
How chivalrous.
Hmm?
How chivalrous.
Yes. Yeah. Made no difference. Italians responded with an airship that came out, had a look at them, and thought, no, I'm not staying here, and went off again.
Were there aircraft on any of the dreadnoughts?
No,
any seaplanes?
But you didn't need it because they had the Austrian, the Navy was efficient, so was their Air Force. They had the best seaplane carriers of the war, and they commanded the Adriatic. One of the reasons that they were less troubled by enemy submarines was that the aircraft cover the Adriatic. The first submarine ever to be sunk by an aircraft will be a French one at the hands of an Austro-Hungarian aircraft, seaplane carrier. Seaplane, not seaplane carrier, seaplane.
Yeah.
So they had a good air force. They didn't have anything much in the anti-aircraft. In fact, further up the coast, one of their semi-dreadnoughts, they had 4 semi-dreadnoughts. The difference between that and a dreadnought is that they're sort of in between pre-dreadnoughts, which just have 4 heavy guns, 2 at each end, and lots of little ones. A semi-dreadnought has 4 heavy guns and 4 medium heavy guns, or 8 medium heavy guns along the side. In this case was 7.5 inch.
Mm-hmm.
And then a dreadnought is just all big guns. So they had 4 of these. They were very well built, actually. The 𝐬𝐮𝐬𝐽 class, and the 𝐬𝐮𝐬𝐽 herself was to attack Rimini, and they were attacked by the Italian airship, and the 𝐬𝐮𝐬𝐽 had no anti-aircraft fire, so she had to do a merry dance around the sea to avoid the attack from the airship, and the airship had to sort of do a dance to try and get in to attack. So they had a sort of little dance. This was not unusual because 2 of their coastal battleships later in the war were also attacked by Italian aircraft, and they still hadn't got any anti-aircraft guns. Ooh. But the Italians couldn't. But what made the difference was when the Italians' aircraft turned up and the airship had to disappear quickly. And that's,
you mean the Austrian aircraft?
Austria, sorry, yes. Yeah, the Austro-Hungarian aircraft turned up. So probably the most famous action of that night was a destroyer whose name is difficult to pronounce. I think it's like Shlusta or something like that. It's really difficult. I'm sorry. I think it's Croatian.
Well, that would explain it.
But one of the harbors they attacked further up the coast, it was very, very narrow. The inner harbor, the outer harbor, they went in. It was a heavy cruiser and 2 torpedo boats and a light cruiser and a destroyer. And the destroyer decided to go into the inner harbor, but it's very narrow. Literally, it went into the inner harbor. There is literally its sides are touching the sides of the harbor. So it just sailed in. It had to reverse to get out. And once it was in, it just blazed away with everything it got. And in the records, it says that included 50 pistols from its officers. And then it reversed out. And the only casualty of the night was at that attack when a torpedo boat got hit by a coastal battery. Nobody was killed. It was just damaged. But it went and hid behind the cruiser for the rest of the action. And that was it. That was the only hit the Italians made on the entire fleet that night at Ancona and along the coast.
They didn't have coastal forts or anything protecting
They did, but they didn't operate them. The Austro-Hungarian Navy got them completely by surprise. This is the day after the war started. They didn't expect them. The Austrians had planned it, and it got completely by surprise. They wrecked the Eastern Railway. It delayed the mobilization of Italy by 3 weeks, which is enough for the Austro-Hungarians to get to the border. And the Italians never, at any point in the war, ever crossed the border.
No.
All the battles were in Italy.
They tried.
They tried 12 times at 𝐬𝐮𝐬𝐫𝐞.
It's or in Trento, where they had all the. And it's interesting when you said before, when they started building the dreadnoughts, and the Italians built 4 and they built 4. This was 1904, 10.
Oh, 1911, 1912.
1911.
1913.
They were still allied.
Yes.
But already from 1905s, they were building armored forts up in the Alps. And when the Austrians, they built, I think, 7. Well, the Italians built 7. And when the Austrians, they installed a gun, the Italians installed a bigger gun. Because they were all built by the same laborers in the same area, some 10 miles apart, 10 kilometers apart. And
well, so Italy and Austria-Hungary, Italy and Austria are traditional enemies. That was the alliance was really with Germany. But having said that, in the years just before the war, the Italians had become anti-French. The Italians wanted to be a Mediterranean power, and the only real rival was the French. So they had become anti-French. And every prime minister from, I think, 1912 was anti-French, except one. The one who was prime minister when the war broke out in 1914.
Yeah,
so declared neutrality instead. And then later, I wouldn't say the Allies brought Italy into the war. The better word is bought Italy into the war. They offered more than the Austrians. The Germans were trying to say, you know, Austria, give them Trieste or something, you know, and the Austrians say, no, absolutely not. Not giving our territory away. You give theirs, but not ours. So, but the Allies said, no, you can have Trieste and Dalmatia, and the Adriatic will be yours, and you can have, you know. So
giving away other people's stuff is always easy.
Yeah, the Treaty of London, I think it was called, which offered them loads of stuff, which Britain and France didn't fulfill at Versailles, and the Italians were very, very upset, which led to Mussolini and so forth.
It's easy to give away other people's stuff that you don't have. You can have it if you can take it.
Yeah. Well, no, we said you could have it. We win, you can have it. And then we said, well, maybe not.
Yeah, well, they had no problem splitting up Austria and Hungary and Austria in general, did they? I think the Austria got...
But she sort of split up on her own accord.
It's interesting now you finally dig into the causes of World War I that has always been blamed on the Germans, where the Kaiser was probably the least one to blame by the fact that he wasn't really that. You could look at the four main antagonists in this. Their foreign ministers were to blame more than anybody. The Russians certainly, the French were certainly pushing. The Kaiser, I don't think he saw where this was going. And once he saw where it was going, it was too late. And he sent the famous note recanting on the promise to assist. And that was too late.
Well, the Germans blamed the British. And I agree with them. The British were at fault for the First World War.
That was great.
Because Europe had maintained peace and a balance of power. It's a German balance of power. Basically, France was isolated, or it had Russia for a while, you know. But basically, France, who had always felt dishonored by the loss of the War of 1871 and the loss of Alsace-Lorraine, and many of the French elite felt it deeply. In fact, the French president in 1914, Poincaré, he was from Alsace-Lorraine. And the Tsar said of him, that is a man, I'm a man of peace, said the Tsar. Poincaré is a man waiting for his war. But the Germans dominated, arranged the diplomatic system such that they dominated. And the French could never take them on their own, even with the Russians with them.
No.
They didn't have particularly the financial power to do it. The British were aloof. And then in 1898, we nearly went to war with France. And as a result, we thought we needed a continental ally. So our natural ally is Germany. We'd always been friends with Germany. We tend to forget that, the British, but we were always friends with Germany from when it was Prussia in 1700. Yeah. And the Germans turned us down, which was a big mistake on their part. And the French saw their opportunity.
Yes. So
through what were called, and it was a Frenchman, it was the French foreign minister who termed the term in 1892. Treaties are not strong because they're legal documents, and as every lawyer knows, you can get round a legal document. An entente is a friendship. Once you create a friendship, it's much harder to break. So the French began to become friends, and they lured the British more and more. And the British new government of 1996, the foreign secretary was not confident enough to understand what the French were up to. And once the French had felt secure enough that the British were in their camp, they started to become aggressive. The Germans noted that in 1912, both Russia and France were suddenly becoming aggressive. And they were very concerned. Why? And the answer was they had the British in their pocket. And so when the war broke out, what took the Germans by surprise was the British. Why? But it was a matter of honor. It wasn't Belgium. I've got the evidence of that. It wasn't Belgium. It was honor. And in fact, the crucial statement was Paul Gabon, who was the French ambassador, to the British foreign secretary, when he said, Well, he said, about the possibility of British neutrality. Maybe the word honour has to be redefined in the Oxford Dictionary.
Gabon said that, or Edward Grey?
Gabon, the French ambassador, to Lord Grey, Foreign
Yes.
Secretary. And the next night, at the cabinet meeting that decides to go to war, Grey doesn't mention Belgium. He mentions honour. Britain will lose its honour, its international honour, if it doesn't back the French.
Yes. And that was backed up by a very interesting media campaign on behalf of the French as well, because when everyone started to armor, and of course their alliance with Russia, which was very specifically because, like you said, Poincaré was from Alsace-Lorraine, and he even had dirt from Alsace at home. His wife planted flowers specifically in the Alsace dirt to not forget where he was from, and he told his gardener he would be fired if any of them ever died. He was very much bent on getting back what. And let's not forget, just for a minute, that there was the French that declared war on Prussia in 1870. But anyway, provoked or not, they still did it, and it didn't go well. But the press campaign started. They lied about who called to arms first, because the Russians called up their army before, and as did the French, before the Germans did. But the media, they lied. They put out a story that the Germans had called up their soldiers first by 3 days. So therefore the others had, while it had actually been in reverse. So we even see how there's a little bit of fake news going on back then, just to get everybody on the side.
Well, the Germans argued that Britain tipped the balance, gave the French and the Russians the opportunity they were looking for. And so instead of kowtowing, as they had done before, to any German pressure diplomatically, they stood up.
Yes.
And before the Germans knew it, they were at war.
Yeah.
Actually, one of the things that gets me is that when the war broke out, when Britain joined the war on the 4th of August, there was one major European power that was not at war with them, or anyone. Austro-Hungary.
Austria-Hungary
didn't enter the war. She'd gone to war with Serbia. It happened when as I said, when the German battlecruiser 𝐬𝐮𝐬𝐜𝐫𝐢, the Mediterranean squadron, was heading up the Mediterranean, being chased by the British fleet. And they asked for support from the Austro-Hungarian Navy. And this is the 6th of August. And the Austro-Hungarians reply is, why? And they say, well, because we're at war. They said, yeah, but we're not.
So when did they realize they were?
So the Germans said, look, we've gone to war for you against the Russians. Yeah, but we didn't ask you to. And we're not at war with the Russians. So the Germans said, honor bound, you have to declare war on the Russians. So they declared war on the Russians. I think that's the 9th of August. And the Russians said to the French and British, you're honor bound, you must declare war on Austro-Hungary. So they declared war on the 12th of August. Germany had literally gone to war on behalf of another power and found out that the other power hadn't actually gone to war itself. I mean, that is the stupidity of the German actions of 1914. I mean, my blame is the Germans were just stupid. I mean, they just really got themselves into a fix and couldn't get out of it. They weren't aggressive. They were just stupid.
I mean, speaking of how their foreign minister had told the British what they intended to do beforehand, vis-a-vis going through Belgium, yeah, that wasn't exactly the pinnacle of diplomacy.
Oh, but we knew that anyway. There is a wonderful book written in 1885 called The Great War of 1882, which talks about a European war. It begins with an assassination in the Balkans. It leads to the Austro-Hungarians and the Russians mobilizing. It leads to the Germans telling the Russians if they don't stop mobilizing, there'll be a war, which is exactly how that First World War happened. And the war comes about. The British remain neutral. The Germans then invade Belgium because this is written by British journalists and military staffs,
Really?
But it's so obvious that if Germany is to attack France, it has to go through Belgium. Everybody goes through Belgium. It's got more battlefields than any other part of Europe. Everyone goes through Belgium.
It's where European settlers their scores.
Yeah, it's because it's the only flat land between there and the Alps, So it was obvious. There is a wonderful chapter where the British decide whether they should go to war because Belgium's neutrality has been violated, and the answer is no. Why should we? And so they don't. They go to war with France and Russia because Russia's violated some other treaty, the Cyprus Agreement, 2 weeks later. It's very interesting because actually the Germans lose at the Marne. They get to the Marne, and according to the book, they're defeated. The only reason that the British Germans win is that, of course, the British Royal Navy defeats the Russian French Navy in the Mediterranean with another Trafalgar, and the French sue for an armistice, even though they're driving the German army back through Belgium. It's
fascinating. That is very interesting. I did not know. I have to get that book.
Yeah, it's wonderfully written. It's journalists basically, and they've written it as if it's newspaper reports. So it's like each little section is like a newspaper report. What's going on,
It's interesting because almost every conflict we've had in the last 100+ years, there's always been someone some years before saying, "Well, this is going to happen. This is how it's going to happen." I didn't know that far in advance of World War One. Same thing. That is very interesting. Maybe it is all scripted. But I mean, Belgium could have saved themselves a whole lot of trouble if somewhere after 1970 they just built a large 6-lane road straight through from Germany to France. I think that's why the Germans are so upset with the Belgians in World War One, because they wouldn't just let them go through.
No, they expected it. In the book of 1885, that's what the Belgians do. There's a prior agreement. And also, because the Germans are in the book, one of the reasons the British are quite happy for the Germans to do it is that Belgium neutrality is about Britain, because Belgium is the advanced defense of Britain, because it's the launch pad for any continental army invading Britain. It was called in the 17th century the forward bastion of British soil, the Flanders coastline. Antwerp in particular, when the Austrians acquired Antwerp in 1648, an Ostend, that was the first naval port. The Austro-Hungarian naval port was Ostend. When they had ran Belgium for a while, they were allowed to have it, but the British insisted in the treaty that Ostend and Antwerp could not be turned into major bases. So in that book, what the Germans do is they allow the British army to occupy Antwerp for the duration of the war, to guarantee that no German army or French army will attack Britain from Antwerp. But that's the fear, and that's why they wanted it neutral in the original treaty back in 1839, was because they didn't want any European power to control that coastline.
So they couldn't have just let them go through anyway. They have to make a stand to give the British time to mobilize.
They needed, yes, the Germans needed to have made a deal with the British. In the book, that's what they do.
Yeah.
What they didn't do in 1914 is make any attempt at a deal with the British. They didn't say, "Oh, look, you occupy Antwerp," or Belgium were not. But part of the Belgium's reason it resisted was that the French had persuaded the Belgians that the British were going to support them.
Yes.
So they knew beforehand that the British, and that was in 1906. What the way the French integrated the British in was they had private conversations, just chats between military officers about a possible future war, as you do.
Yes, you do.
And Belgium was thinking about that. So they invited the British officers, particularly ones that were anti-German and pro-French, to come along to Belgium in 1906 and say, "Oh, well, we could do this, we could do that." And the Belgians got the impression that the British will be there for them. And so they were more prepared to resist the German army, thinking, "Well, we got the French, we got the British backing us, we can withstand." So they did. They might not have done that if the British hadn't sort of had these military conversations, they're called.
Yes.
Very subtle way, which is why when the war broke out, the British Army went to France, because those conversations, the only plan was the French plan. The British had no other plan for a war with Germany other than what the French had put in their ear, which was come and be part of the French army.
Yeah, not much different from World War II. Roughly the same design. But the interesting about World War One is it was a war that started because of a little more than a handful of people's decisions. It was such a small number of people that kicked this off. It's surprising. And I know that the German and the British Navy, they had hangout. They were doing not joint maneuvers, but fleet visits, certainly all the way up until early 1914, didn't they?
Well, I think it's the problem with deterrence. Deterrence works, which is how it was. The Germans deterred the French, and as long as that the people involved are rational, reasonably intelligent human beings. When they're idiots or stupid or short-sighted, it doesn't work.
You mean politicians?
Yeah, it just ends up in war.
No.
I'm deterring you. Oh, what's that? If you don't feel deterred, you're not. So it's not a good. The solution.
I know it's a great idea when it works.
Yeah, the solution is the present solution, which is the European Union, because we talk to each other. So we haven't had a European war, and for the longest period, I think, of probably forever.
I think they gave the EU the Peace Prize a couple of years ago for that. But giving a bunch of bureaucrats a Peace Prize seems interesting as a concept. But
the country that thought up the concept to begin with was Austro-Hungary.
I thought it was
Austro-Hungary wanted to create a European a union to create more autonomous states within it, because it knew the empire was doomed. Yes. The heir to the throne, the one who got assassinated, Franz Ferdinand, wanted to create a sort of like where each state could be autonomous but linked together through economic and trade and the idea sort of, because it was a multi-ethnic, and then the Germans took it over in the First War. One of their plans was called what they call Metal Europe, which is a huge state of independent countries, but all economically joined, as their post-war plan.
I believe
Germany dominated, of course.
The Prussians had talked about this as well. In the 1870s, there was some talk about how to expand part of the German unification. There was some talk within that sphere. Well, if we all were together, but I get it's a good idea. I mean, it's a good idea. It's a good idea. I mean, Himmler.
Well, you're right. The German Empire actually began as an economic union in 1848. I've forgotten that. Yes, because it began. That's how the empire was created. The Prussian Empire, as it really should really be. It wasn't really a German empire; it was a Prussian empire.
Even the Romans had to try to figure something out to that, because I suppose the Roman Empire at its highest was, well, the same thing. Run a bunch of warring tribes, trying to keep them under one roof.
Trade and commerce.
Yeah. I guess there's only so
needed their wine. Well, no, the French. No, never mind. Wine was the big trade. Yeah. Wine for olive oil and that sort of. Yeah, basically trade and commerce. And the United States as well. 50 countries, 50 states, one union.
Yes.
And you've got very different states. I mean,
yes.
I mean, I've been to Vermont, and it's nothing like Louisiana, you know.
Nope.
But in one state, and that's just amazing.
It's interesting when you mention how the Austro-Hungarians brought together to get to build the 4 dreadnoughts. You got to build something, part of it. You got to build some part of it. Exactly the same thing as how we cobble defense projects together over here. We have parts made in each state. Of course, it also means when it fails, littoral coastal ship, and can't do any of the things that it was supposed to do, littoral ship. You can't just cancel the bloody thing, because there's no senator's going to go up and say, yeah, we got to shut this down, because there's a peace made in every one of the states. So there's a plus and a minus to this. So what? Speaking of going back to our wonderful dreadnoughts, did you ever see the Texas?
No, I've only been to Northeast America.
I think it's in
New England,
in Houston. Up there, north of the Mason-Dixon line.
Yeah, well, I'm from. I've been there because it's nearer where I was born, and Canada. I come from the maritime provinces. You know, I've got my little flag here, New Brunswick. Not the only one who's ever heard of it. So yeah, I just crossed the border into New England. So
I want to see the Texas. There's not a whole lot of dreadnoughts left, or pre-dreadnoughts even. I know the Texas is one they finally got out of the water, they have it restored, and it's going to be put up. Trying to figure out where to put it, which you would think would be a luxury problem, but apparently they were going to moor it somewhere in Houston. And some idiot restaurant owner at the harbor frontier was complaining, and it would block their view. And I'm like, you get a museum ship that will bring thousands of people, and you're complaining about. Some people are very short-sighted, but they're going to put it somewhere. Obviously, they spent millions of dollars restoring it. What other dreadnoughts are there? There's no tumble hulls left anywhere, are there? None of them survive to this day.
There's a pre-dreadnought, which is the Mikasa in Japan.
Yes, that's not a tumble hull. That's just, I think. And then you have the Russian. What's the one in Moscow? The one that won the revolution.
Oh, the cruiser Aurora.
Aurora that survived Tsushima.
Yes.
Just.
I mean, I try to think of other dreadnoughts. Are there not more? Isn't there another American dreadnought preserved somewhere?
I think there might be one up in Philadelphia or somewhere.
But we're not very good at that, and you know, they're almost all gone. I mean, the one to reserve would be an HMS Dreadnought, but we couldn't even be bothered with that. You know, the very first.
I mean, could you keep Warspite, for the love of God?
No, not in the Warspite. The most decorated and active dreadnought of them all. We couldn't even preserve our last one, which was HMS Vanguard, although there was a lot of pressure. The last battleship of ours was HMS Vanguard, which carried dreadnought guns, because we used old guns because we couldn't get the new ones. And we got one. We got the Ramillies gun outside the Imperial War Museum in London. That's about it, I think.
Okay, at least there is that.
Yeah, but yeah, you're right.
So who
built? There were so many of them as well.
Who built the three Austrian dreadnoughts then? Where were they built?
They were built in Austria.
Where?
Where? Oh, well, the Hungarian one was built at the yard near Fiume, if I remember correctly, and the other three were at Trieste.
In Trieste, okay. Yeah, that was
the naval base was Polar, but the base of operations is Trieste. It's on the same peninsula. But Fiume was actually, which I also forgot in my talk, is that Fiume is also known for something else. It's where torpedoes come from, because Whitehead couldn't get the British interested, so he went to Austro-Hungary and he developed the torpedo at Fiume, which is where Whitehead was based.
Really?
Yeah,
I did not know that.
And the Austro-Hungarians were interested in innovation. I mean, when I did the army talk, the best tank of the war, a really good tank of the First World War, was Austro-Hungarian. They built one in 1911. And it's actually a good tank, and it was built in 1911, years before anyone else. It wasn't. They didn't go beyond, because this is the problem with the Austro-Hungarian. The commander, he said he couldn't see the role of a tank in modern warfare. But then he couldn't see the role of artillery in modern warfare. He had written the book on infantry tactics something like 1876 or something like that. And the Austro-Hungarians follow that book because their commander-in-chief wrote it. And it doesn't mention artillery support of infantry. It's just the bayonet.
Yeah.
Now that the Russians thought the same way, and the British thought the worst way, the French, but everybody learned quickly. But the Austro-Hungarian commander, who commanded right through to the end of the war, never learned that. So his last offensive, he didn't have much artillery support, which was 1918.
It was the Germans that came in and began with the artillery support for them, wasn't it?
Yeah. Oh no, this last battle, which was Piava, in the summer of June 1818, the Austro-Hungarians got there in a pickle because the Germans wanted the commander sacked because he was so incompetent.
Yes, I remember.
But the Kaiser wouldn't. The Austrian Kaiser wouldn't. So there was a very competent Croatian commander. So instead of putting him in command, instead of this one, they split the army between them. So one half had one half of the army and the other had the other half of the army. And they were going to do this offensive on the Piava River. Well, neither one wanted to do it in the same place.
Yeah.
Now, the Croatian was good. He broke across the river and formed a bridgehead into the Italian army. But he had no reserves because the other half of the army was upriver getting itself massacred, trying to cross the river because Kozendorf couldn't know how to do it. He was still doing mass infantry attacks in 1918, where everybody else wouldn't have dreamed of it,
Yeah, splitting command I don't remember any instance of when this worked. I'm sure somebody will mention once, but even the Romans knew this was a bad idea. Fighting Hannibal, they tried that bit of game.
The Croatian commander was a good commander. He should have been put. They might have won at Piave, which would have been a victory in 1918 for the Austrians, which may have held the Austrian-Hungarian Empire together for a bit longer, but they lost instead. And then they had to wait for the Italian counteroffensive.
Yeah. Was there not a Hungarian captain of one of the dreadnoughts? Or was that just me remembering that wrong?
There was.
They were not all Austrian, were they?
No, they were Italian, mainly Italian and Austrian. The commander-in-chief of the Austro-Hungarian Navy was an Italian in 1940, Montecuccoli. They had Italian officers. That's that wonderful incident I mentioned in the talk of the Italian destroyer that finds the Austrian destroyers on the way back from Ancona attack in the dark and hails them. And then after they get the reply, wishes them well and goes off, because the reply came back in perfect Italian because they just got an Italian officer on the ship to reply for them. And the sinking of the battleship Benetta Brin, the pre-dreadnought, the Italian pre-dreadnought, was sabotage. Austrian officers walked onto it, put the bombs, and walked off it while it was in harbour. But of course, they were all Italian, so nobody questioned the Italian people dressed in Italian officer gear as Italians walking onto a ship and walking off it. But there were Croatians and there were Hungarians, and the most famous Hungarian was Admiral Hothi, who became the final commander. And he became the final commander, and he did the aggressive campaigns in 1918, and that's how they lost a dreadnought. Because they were attacking the Otranto barrage, and he had worked out that as the destroyers attacked them, the British and the Italians would send their cruisers out, and then the Austrians would bring their cruisers out. But their cruisers weren't strong enough. I mean, the British cruisers are mounting 6-inch guns, and the Austrians are 4-inch guns. So, But he thought, here's an opportunity to inflict a huge blow on the British and the Italians. We'll bring the battleships down, the dreadnoughts down. And so when they chase our cruisers, the dreadnoughts will arrive and just flatten them.
Yeah.
But he wanted to be secret, so he decided to send the dreadnoughts down to Katora, 2 at a time, so that they just looked like they were going out to sea for a patrol and they were going back again. He wanted to keep it completely secret. And so he sent those 2 out, the St. Stephen and I think the other one was the Tetragráf. And the Italians' motor torpedo boats happened to be in the area. It was a coincidence. although I'm never quite sure that in wartime there is such a thing as coincidence, or whether it's just superior intelligence that we're not going to tell you we have. But anyway, they happened to be in the area when the two dreadnoughts, so they attacked them. They missed the Tetragráf, but they got a torpedo in the St. Stephen's, so Svennisvan, and that's how it got sunk. But it was they were risking their dreadnoughts for an aggressive action. They weren't hiding them in the harbour like a fleeting being. They were actually, Hothi was taking them out down to the Entente barrage to attack the British and French cruisers there.
I mean, that was almost a mutiny in the German fleet because they weren't doing anything.
There was one in the Austro-Hungarian as well for the same reason. At Katora, the heavy cruisers and the coastal battleships, they had a mutiny in 1916. But the cruisers and destroyers who were active, because they were all going down to attack the Otranto barrage, their crews refused to participate and help put the mutiny down. The Austro-Hungarian Navy then investigated the cause, and the cause was they felt that the crews on the battleships and the cruisers, heavy cruisers, weren't doing anything and they were getting bored. So they sacked the commander who thought they're better fleet in being, and appointed Hothi, who was already the commander of the cruisers that were doing the aggressive action. And he took command and he said, right, well, we're going to do something with them.
I mean, mutiny because they don't feel they're doing enough. That's almost worthy of a medal. Did they get punished? Because I mean, that if there's ever an honorable reason to protest.
Well, a few ringleaders I would suspect get punished or shot or hanged or whatever. It's just a normal thing, but most of them wouldn't. And I think the Austrian Navy was particularly investigating, much better than the German Navy. It actually investigated why and then took action. So, oh, they're not doing anything. We'll do something. We'll get them involved. It is obviously the light cruisers and the destroyer crews are content because they're doing something. We need to get our heavy cruisers and battleships involved. And this is what led up to that 1918 attempt to bring the dreadnoughts down from Pola to Katora to set up a trap for the British cruisers. But it didn't happen because they lost one.
So that I always joke around about 1915 about when the Italians finally decide what side they're on and declare war on someone. The Austrians knew. They had a hunch that this is where it was going.
Yeah, they did.
They raided. They're not just one place. They went all along the coast.
They started with Venice with aircraft. They attacked Venice with aircraft, and then they went down the coast, Ravenna, Rimini, down to Ancona. You look at the ports, and they look at the railway line running down, and Ancona is the major hub, blowing up viaducts, railway yards, for the damage of one small torpedo boat.
Are there any pictures of any of this damage? I'm just saying, as I'm hoping that I'm saying this, I'm showing this to people as we speak.
I don't know. You might get a picture. I know the name of the ship was 74T. I mean, it didn't have a name. It was 74T because it's a torpedo boat. It's not a destroyer.
What about the damage on the Italian side? There must be some pictures of this.
I haven't found any. I just know there was. There's a picture of the airship. There is a picture of the airship and that was that lovely story which I told that as those Austro-Hungarian destroyers were traveling back through the night, they heard paddles. So they turned the lights on and found an Italian fruit seller who had put out to sea because he heard that there were warships off the coast and assumed they were Italian and hoped he could sell some fruit. Only discovered they were Austrian, and they didn't buy it. They took it.
Oh.
Yeah, I know. They let him go, but they took the fruit.
You know this war. You know the story of the Russian Pacific Fleet on the way to Toshima.
Mm-hmm.
Which one? Was it 1903?
I know. I know that. Sorry,
I remember after they shot up the British trawler fleet. At some point, a little ship come paddling, a little fisher boat comes up to the main battleship to tell the admiral, he had been promoted, and they were all shooting at it. And I keep picturing this little fishing vessel in the middle of this whole great fleet that's all firing big guns at it, and everybody missed it when it was holding up a note that you've been promoted for your great job.
Well, the Japanese got to that. They got all missed the Japanese, didn't they? Their gunnery was pretty poor. In fact, the admiral got the job of admiral of the fleet because he did before the Tsar. He wanted to show how good he trained the gunnery, and he built these buildings for a bombardment. But they built so that if shell landed near it, they fell down. So it was all show. But the Tsar was so impressed that he made him he promoted him and he became admiral of the fleet.
I mean, I think he was the right man. He seemed to be the right commander. I can't. What was his name? Rozhensky.
Rozhensky, yeah, had a terrible temper.
A terrible temper, with all the binoculars flying.
Yeah,
I'm sure somebody must have made the movie of him, even maybe the Russians. But I think that's worthy. That's worthy of a movie.
Well, it's his main skill was not teaching his fleet to learn how to shoot well. By the time he reached Tsushima, he got them to stay in line.
Yes,
but that took a lot of effort through that voyage to keep those ships in line,
and not shooting at each other or other things they're not supposed to shoot at.
Yes. It took a lot of effort and a lot of shouting. Apparently, I've read an account by an officer on the ''Ural, and he was just known for always shouting at them. But I feel it was frustration. He had this fleet of 4 modern battleships. They were really good battleships, and he couldn't get them in line. They couldn't shoot straight. And also, being Russians, when the Russians discovered they were going to send a fleet to the Pacific, they had to man them. So they rounded up all the political prisoners. Oh. This person on the ''Ural was a political prisoner. And so they were the most anti-Russian, anti-Tsar crew to be sent out.
That I did not know.
The political prisoners said, "You're going to the Pacific and get rid of them."
Oh, that's such a bad idea on so many levels. No wonder nothing worked. Oh, I did not know that. That's interesting. So who trained the Austro-Hungarian crews? Where were they? How did they build a navy up from? Where did that come from?
They founded the navy just in the Napoleonic War, which was where was it? 1786. They acquired Venice. So the initial one, probably part of the reason it was efficient, because it was much of the officers were originally ex-Venetian, which was Venice, of course, was a sea power.
Yes.
With a tradition of the navy. And then they had good commander-in-chief. The first one, they were archdukes, brothers of the Kaiser, and Imperial Archduke. And it's very Austro-Hungarian. They established in 1814, they set up the Imperial and Royal Naval Cadet School very early on, 1849. Well, the British Navy didn't set up a cadet school until the 1860s at Britannia in Dartmouth.
Really?
So it was well before them, yes.
Interesting.
And both, they believed in an efficient officer corps. The next commander-in-chief was Archduke Frederick, appointed in 1840 at the age of 23, and still remains the youngest commander-in-chief of any navy, 23. But he was outstanding. He modernized the navy. And one of the things he did was, one of the reasons they got the cadet school was they wanted to train Austrians, because mostly they're reliant on Venetian Italians, which was a really lucky thing, because in 1848 they lost Venice, and with it most of the officer corps. But they had a cadre of Austrian officers to build on because of the cadet school, and they built that up from there on. And then the next commander was Maximilian, who modernized it, built ironclads, built a warship. This would be the first warship to go around the world of the Austro-Hungarian Navy, the Navarra. It was also the ship that took Maximilian to Mexico during the American Civil War, the Emperor's brother. And of course, the Mexicans shot him. But the Navarra took him to Mexico. So And then of course they led them to the Battle of Lissa, which was an overwhelming victory over the Italian fleet, which was bigger and more powerful than the Austrian navy. But they won an overwhelming when they rammed and sunk the flagship.
I was just going to say that's the one where they all rammed each other and did things.
It was the action that made the navies of the world think ramming was the way forward. So every ship right up to 1900 had to have a ram bow. But in fact, you have to be fairly stopped to be rammed. Any ship that's moving with any kind of speed is very difficult to hit it. But the fact that the Ria d'Italia was stopped when it was rammed was overlooked. It was just, oh, rams, we must have rams. Because there was no other ironclad battle of any major significance other than Lissa. But it was a great victory against the odds. But because the 𝐾𝐿 was so strong, and that carries it through into the First World War.
Well, I don't know if you know, but the U.S. Navy has brought ramming back in the South Pacific over the past couple of years. I don't know if you noticed.
No, I didn't know it.
There's like, I think 4 or 5 instances where we run into tanker ships and other things like, gigantic objects or each other. Not you speaking of an efficient officer corps. We may want to define that in the hope that someone is listening. All right, I'm in the Army. I have to make fun of the Navy people but could you please sail straight? I remember you telling a story of one of the dreadnoughts that are lending a support to the naval to guns on the mountain.
Yes, it was a battleship. The French brought heavy artillery against Katara from the mountain, the Montenegrin mountain that overlooks it, and they brought up the coastal battleship Budapest, which has 12-inch guns, and they drove them off. Then the Austrians decided the next year to actually drive the Montenegrins off the mountain because they could still fire on Katara to be a nuisance. They couldn't take it, but they could fire as a nuisance. But the Budapest guns couldn't lift up high enough to hit the top of the mountain where the Montenegrin trenches were. So they sank her sideways. They flipped her sideways like that.
They flooded part of the ship?
They flooded one half of her so that and therefore the guns could now point high enough up,
Yeah.
And then they could hit the trenches just before the Austrians charged up the mountain and took them. So, yeah.
Did the captain do any math on this, or was this just one of those things on the fly? Because you could see halfway rolled over, firing guns would give you that little extra kick. And
well, I presume so. I believe their officers knew their ballistics, and could calculate the angle required that would be needed and allow the guns to do it. But that's how they got the elevation, was to literally flood one side of the ship so that it was half sunk.
See, these are the pictures of history that were never taken. These are the things we all wanted to see.
Well, 2 sister ships these were 5,000-ton coastal battleships. The 2 sister ships, the Vienne and I forgot what the other one was. They constantly bombarded the Italian army through 1915-19. They just went up the coast and bombarded them. When the Germans helped the Austrians defeat the Italians at Caporetto and the Italians fell back, they fell back under the guns of these 2 little coastal battleships. And the Italians, who had modern cruisers in Venice, refused to come out and attack them. So they just carried on. They attacked them with aircraft, but the Austrian-Hungarian aircraft simply drove them off. So the only way to save Italian pride was the little motor torpedo boats, mass boats as they're called, which is just a little boat with 2 torpedoes on it. And they entered the harbour, Trieste, and sank one of them. And you can actually see, there's a museum at Trieste, and you can actually see the stern of the Vienna.
Still,
they brought that up.
Oh,
and it's got Vienna on it. I have put this a picture on in my talk, and it comes out. It's in the museum, and it says Vienna. And it was the one that was sunk by the Italian torpedo. And that was the first major warship that the Austrians had lost. I mean, the losses were extremely light to begin with compared to the Italians. The Italians had lost heavy cruisers, they had lost battleships. The Austrians didn't lose a large ship, more than 2,000 tons, until 1917, when this coastal battleship of 5,000 tons was sunk. And then the next one would be the St. Stephen in 1918.
It wasn't until late war the Italians began to get a handle on this at all.
Well, the Italian torpedo. The Italian Navy, both in the First World War and the Second World War, does not cover itself with glory. It has really good ships. The Vittorio Veneto was one of the best warships in the world in the Second World War, but it didn't sort of cover itself with glory. But their torpedo service is completely different. Very aggressive and much more successful. Their little torpedo boats and their human torpedoes were very successful. I think it's a bit like the Austro-Hungarian army. The Italians had, in the echelons of command, not very aggressive, good commanders. But the Italians themselves are very brave, and lower down in the lower parts, they're much different. Italians, there's this myth that the Italians are not brave, and I don't agree to it. I think all the evidence is the Italians are just as brave as anyone else, but their officer corps isn't very aggressive and tends to give up a bit too easy.
Except one. Cordona.
Except one.
Cordona.
Cordona.
He killed more of his own men than the enemy did.
Cordona, yes. Well, yes, that's Luigi Goldo, yes. Brought back decimation. Very rare.
There's a character nobody wants to work for.
The French and the British refused to support the Italians after Caporetto unless they sacked Cordona.
Not a moment too soon.
Send troops.
And not a moment too soon.
Not a moment too. Well, the Germans had the same with the issue of Count Hotzendorf, because they had an army group in the Austro-Hungarian army, and he nearly lost it in the Carpathian Mountains in the winter of 1915. And the Germans were horrified. And then in the Brusilov offensive in 1916, again, they nearly lost the German army. And so the Germans, after Brusilov offensive, where the Austrian-Hungarian army came within 2 days of total destruction, the Russians nearly achieved what everyone else wanted, the breakthrough and nearly knocking out a major power from the war. It's just that they did a blitzkrieg, but because you're doing it on foot, you ran out of steam, and they had to rest for 2 days. And that 2 days was vital because it gave the Germans the chance to bring their troops down from the north and reinforce the collapsing Austro-Hungarian army from total collapse.
Yeah.
But after that, the Germans said, no, we don't want him as commander-in-chief of the Austro. We're not supporting the Austro-Hungarian army if you have him as commander-in-chief, and we have to have German staff officers in your army to make sure you do the right thing. But the Kaiser said, no, we'll make him sort of equal commander. They couldn't get rid of him. But yeah, they had the same. Germans had the same issue with the Austro-Hungarians. They just they was horrified at the incompetence of the Austro-Hungarians commander-in-chief. At least he didn't shoot 1 in 10, but he would destroy whole armies.
And at least he had the good decency of having the enemy do it. He had the good decency of having the enemy shoot his troops.
Yes, he did. He did very much. Well, there's a really good book called Blood on the Snow. Have you ever read it? It's the story of the Carpathian Mountain Campaign of 1915.
Yes, I have it. I haven't read it yet.
Oh, well, it's, as described, it's the Stalingrad of the First World War. I mean, what he did, he never went to the front to see what was going on. His Austrian army had to attack mountain passes in heavy snow, meaning they were attacking machine gun nests in single file.
Brilliant.
and no artillery support because you can't get artillery up the mountains in thick, heavy snow. They lost thousands. And then they had no winter clothing, so they froze. One regiment froze one night in it to a man. They camped, and by the morning they were all frozen to death. And they had no winter clothing. Their shoes were made of cardboard because Austro-Hungary lost access to leather.
Yeah.
They were so running out of men that they took the walking wounded and sent them up. The walking wounded would point out they hadn't got a rifle, and the answer was find one on the way up.
Yeah.
It's just it's an incredible, and and he destroyed not the original army because he had already destroyed that in Galicia. This was the reserve army, the sort of the Landswehr army, and he destroyed that at 𝐃𝐽. So when you get to the following year, he's got basically a raw recruited army, fairly untrained army, and officers who cannot speak the languages of most of their men, except for the German orders. It just, and so the army was never quite the same. But yeah, you read that book, it's shocking. It is it is Stalingrad. So I think the book actually describes it as the Stalingrad of the Great War.
It was
in terms of
very
cold
little
and
written
bitterness.
on the Alpine Wars. There's very little written.
No. Well, the war, the Eastern Front. I always say the Eastern Front. The war is always written by the victors.
Of course.
But the Eastern Front hasn't got any victors, because the people who won the Eastern Front were the Central Powers, and then they lost the war.
Yes.
So there's nobody who wants to tell you about the great victories because they're all defeated. So that's one reason why the Eastern Front doesn't get much.
And yet I find it. Have you traveled throughout Poland and seen some of the World War I forts there?
No, I haven't. No.
You have to. You see some of the Russian forts in Warsaw that they built all the way up, right up. They were still constructing them when Mackensen and Ludendorff showed up. Huge armored forts with 10, 20 meters of cement, steel domes. It's amazing. Low to the ground. They're really, really worth seeing. And then you can travel on to like Przemysl and see some of the Austro-Hungarian forts that again, the same thing, but they're not as modern as the Russian from 1915. I've been doing a couple of documentary series about all these, and the Eastern fronts it's fascinating what they built.
If you want, the Brusilov offensive is almost certainly the best offensive of the war. It's the one that nearly knocked a power out.
Yeah.
I think Brusilov, it's a blitzkrieg. He uses the style of the blitzkrieg, the smashing in, the driving in, uses, before the Germans do, infiltration troops to infiltrate the weak points and isolate the strong points. Everything, he had models made of the line so that Russian officers could study what they were going to go through. He got air supremacy. The Austrian-Hungarians thought, well, you want air supremacy, it's fine. So you could have photographs of all the Austrian positions. He used an idea that 𝐬𝐿𝐫𝐿 came up with, which is a sort of trench in no man's land, but like a large rectangular hole in no man's land. But he used them to tunnel out the Russian officers, Russian troops from their front line, so that they're within yards of the Austrian line and appear. And I think the best bit was he launched a bombardment, a massive bombardment. The Austrians rush to their trenches, the bombardment stops, and nothing happens. Hours, nothing happens. So the Austrians go back to their trenches and say, well, what was that about? Then they start the second, and then they start it up again. And the Austrians are like, well, I don't need to worry about it. Be another, and that's the main attack.
Yeah.
So he launches a barrage simply to get them in, an opening barrage, but it's not the one before the attack. It'll be the second one. And
are there any good writings on the Eastern Front?
There is. There's an excellent book on it's called the Brusilov Offensive. It's an excellent book.
No, that makes sense.
I think it's in one of my suitcases, but I'm sorry, but I can send the details on. But it's I think he's the best general of the war, actually, Brusilov. He never lose. He only loses that offensive because it's not. The Russians believe that to do a proper offensive, you need 9 to 1. He tacked on 1 to 1, equal numbers. The reason he did that is the Russian army's main offensive that year was to be in Poland, and they had built it up. So 3/4 of the Russian army are in Poland. He launches what was meant to be a side offensive, but it nearly wins the war. All he needs is to make sure the German army don't come down from the north. So he asked for the generals in the north to do an attack on the Germans to make them feel that they should stay put. Yeah. So they do exactly that. They do a feint. But it's so obvious the Germans know. They rush forward and then go back again. And the Germans think that's a feint. That means they're not going to attack.
Yeah.
So we'll go south. So the feint just gave the Germans the knowledge, information they wanted about what this huge Russian thing was. They're not going to attack, and that's what they did, because the German generals, the Russian generals in the north said, "Why, Brusilov's doing so well? Why should we do anything?"
Oh, well, that's why
we could lose, and our reputation would be lost. Leave it to Brusilov. He wants it.
What happened to him after the First World War ended?
Oh, it's quite great. He died a hero of the Soviet Union.
Well, I wonder what
he was a general of the Red Army, because when the Bolsheviks took over, he said to his officers, "We serve the Russian people. We don't serve Russian governments. So whoever's the government represents the people. We serve the government because we serve the people." So he said, and because of that, he told his officers not to resist the Bolsheviks. And so they made him a general of the Bolshevik cavalry. And he died in 1923 with full military honors as a hero of the Soviet Union.
Yeah, well, fair enough.
Having began as a Tsar, yes. It's almost all the others were shot, of course, but he wasn't.
Well, that is a whole different story of the tragedy of being Russian forever. It's never been easy.
Not to be Russian.
Yeah, being Russian, it's never been easy. But if you ever decide you want to travel out through Poland, which is, by the way, cheaper than anywhere else in Europe, and I love Poland. I'm actually looking for a summer house or something out there because it's beautiful, very affordable, and you have every other where you look, there's a bunker or a fort or a battlefield or something, and it's very different from the Western Front. That is, like so much happens and on such a large scale, and it actually the lines move. But some of the most modern forts of World War I is there outside Warsaw, and then up the Alps as well. Some of the forts up in the Alps are amazing, because everything you built in the Alps are just amazing, because the view is, you can stand on a ruin, but you're in the Alps, so it still looks good. And they're not overgrown like they are down. I can highly recommend. I go every year to pick up more of them. And I mentioned the battleships in the last episode I did from up there, specifically that they were holding the Austrians while they were, those 3 weeks the Navy bought them. They used to up armor and supply the forts, so they would hold for that first year of the Italians trying to break through up in Trento. And then, of course, they built up their offensive and pushed them all the way back past the Italian forts. And so what the battleships really did hold the line.
Yeah, these 2 little coastal battleships. You mean the Vienna and the what was the third one? I got it down. But yeah, and they were built in about 1895. I mean, they were about the size of their light cruisers.
Yeah. So when they were building their dreadnoughts, the Austro-Hungarians, comparatively, where were the British in their ship, being the gold standard at the time?
They were building super dreadnoughts.
Okay, so they were still way ahead.
Oh, way ahead. I mean, a British dreadnought could blow an Austrian dreadnought out of the water, but they never sent them. You know, the things like the Orion class and the 𝐼𝐿𝐫𝐞 class with their 10, 13.5-inch guns, heavy armor. The Austrians were still on 12-inch, so they were dreadnoughts. They were not super dreadnoughts. The British were super dreadnoughts.
But it was still. I like what you say. It was the most successful navy of World War One.
Yeah, it's how you use it, really, isn't it?
Yeah,
it was one of the smallest. It had some of the not necessarily greatest ships, but it was so well handled and so well used. And as I said, people always say, "Oh, it's just a fleet in being," and that's all. I've read it. You know, they say, "Oh, and the Austro-Hungarian Navy was just a fleet in being to keep the Italians busy." It wasn't. It was far from that. And that's what surprised me. It was very active and very successful. You know, to be honest, if they lost, it was against the odds, like 𝐬𝐿𝐫𝐽 against an entire French fleet. You know, with its little pop guns that they couldn't get any closer than 400 years short of the nearest French battleship. That's where they lost. But anywhere else, they won. I like the fact that when an attack on the Otranto barrage and the British gave chase to the Austro-Hungarian cruisers, and they only carry 4-inch, but the British are carrying 6-inch, they hammered. I think it's the Navarra. Until she stopped dead in the water and could go no further. Her engines were done. She had received 45 hits. And at that point, the British pulled off because they saw smoke in the distance and thought the Austrian-Hungarian Navy might be out there and decided they didn't want to take it on. So they turned around, and it wasn't. But they simply, at the moment, they had an Austrian cruiser at the Mersey. They turned away and went back to Malta.
So she was salvaged.
And the Austro-Hungarians regarded it as a victory. They towed this ship back, and they celebrated it as the crew celebrated as a victory. You know, they survived.
It's not who kills the most. It's not who kills the most of the enemy. It's who holds the field afterwards.
Yeah. You know, I mean, the 𝐬𝐿𝐫𝐽 commander was a particularly good commander. And they were like that. They just had good officers.
Yeah, that really has been the key throughout history, hasn't it?
Yeah. You can have the best army in the world, but if you haven't got the officers or the NCOs,
yes,
I would like to add as well. I mean, if any officer knows your sergeant is, or your petty officer, is the working thing, then it won't, you know, you'll just grind. Well, look at the Russian army in Ukraine.
Yeah.
On odds, should have won by now.
That is one of the interesting things the Ukrainian army have learned is NCOs, whereas they were slowly coming out of a Russian system from after the Cold War, where, again, very top heavy, but they've learned that good sergeants, good NCOs is the key, because you have to, if they're well trained and disciplined and know what they're doing, then they can lead. That's one of the things that they. So I mean, everybody's learning.
But that's again, why the French army in the Napoleonics was the best army, because it was led by NCOs, because the French had eliminated the officer corps, i.e., the aristocracy. So all the French generals were ex-sergeants. Well, Napoleon was an ex-corporal.
Yeah.
And they knew how to run an army and make it work, where everyone else was still being run by aristocrats. You know, for the British, you bought your position in the army.
Yes.
I mean, the only reason that Wellington was any good was because his mother thought he was an idiot. And in the British, there's a tradition that the idiot of the family goes in the army. The rest will go in the navy or politics or religion. The idiot goes in the army. So the Wellesleys put Arthur in the army thinking he was the idiot. And by mistake, they put an intelligent man in the army.
Oh, dear.
But he never trusted his officers. He trusted one or two, but most of the time, he didn't trust any of his officers to do what it's actually micromanaged most of the time. He's very good at that.
Well, sometimes you have to, I suppose.
Yeah. Well, but he stood out. It stood out.
Yes,
Well, that's why. If his
yes.
mother thought him was bright, he would have been Archbishop Wellesley or Prime Minister Wellesley. But no, she thought she was an idiot, so they put him in the army.
Thanks. I'm not going to insert a Marine Corps joke in there, but let's leave that alone. I hope one day you may be inclined to come on and do a talk about the Austro-Hungarian army.
Oh, yes. I don't think I've done that. I'm sorry. I've not talked much on the Navy, have I? I thought we got sidetracked sometimes, and I do apologise.
I mean, I think that's what a conversation is all about. But no, I had to share about the dreadnoughts because that I thought the Austrian Navy being fascinating. And I think we can do a probably less glamorous talk on the Austro-Hungarian army.
Yeah. Have you ever seen Blackadder?
Yeah, of course.
Blackadder goes forth.
Of course.
General Melchett.
Of course.
I thought I when I do my talk, I tell them that if General Melchett had commanded the Austro-Hungarian army, they would have been in a better position.
Oh, that's bad.
Yes, it'd be the only army where he'd be regarded as a competent officer. But he would be, because Hotzendorf is, I mean, his object was not so much winning the war as marrying his mistress.
I was just going to say, yeah.
Because his mistress didn't have the required aristocracy to be married to a von.
Well, she was married. Part of the problem.
Oh, yeah. But she also wasn't quite one of us.
I know.
Yeah. So you know the story. So,
yeah, I know. Oh, dear Lord.
All he wanted was, and the one who invaded Serbia, he had a arrogant, and he just wanted to make his name as well.
Yes.
And the invasion of Serbia in 1914 is a lesson in, it's that may be what I thought of General Melchett, because General Melchett, you've got two routes into Serbia. The first route is down the Danube Valley, where you've got a railway line and flat land to march an army along. Or you could go from the west over mountain ranges, which hardly have any roads, let alone no railway line. But first you have to cross the river. And the mountains are facing you, they're in ridges. So you're going up, down, up, down, up, down. Yeah. Only an idiot, only someone who was suicidal would attack from that direction.
Yeah.
Well, the Austrian general's action was, that's why the Serbs won't be expecting us. And on the day they invaded, they reached the river. There was no bridges, and there's no bridging equipment or anything. So as one Austrian said, you had the sight of the Austrian army trouserless crossing the river. They had to take all their trousers off and invade Serbia without trousers. It's an image that's. And we're back in 13 days. It only took.
It didn't go well at all.
No, it didn't. But that's why. They would never expect us to come that way, so we'll go that way. They expect us to come the correct way. And in fact, that's when they took Serbia. In the end, the Germans said, "You go down the Danube Valley," and it worked because Belgrade is not that far from the Austrian border.
It's really not. It's a half-an-hour drive.
But no, he said, no, they'll be expecting us that way. So we'll go the impossible way. So it's like General Melchett, who says when he says, we will attack again. Only an idiot will attack again. That's why we'll do it, because they won't expect us.
It's the last thing they'll expect us to do. The 14th time. Yes.
14th there, so that's why I think General Melchett would have been an improvement, or he certainly would have fitted well in the Austrian High Command.
It would. If only they had more of von Mackensen.
Yes. Well, I always think he's the second best general. I think Brusilov was the best and Mackensen was the second.
They squared off against each other, didn't they?
Pioneered the Blitzkrieg concept between them. Mackensen came up with artillery, and then Brusilov brought in the infiltration.
No, go ahead.
Oh, sorry. And that's what a blitzkrieg is, infiltration, isn't it? You blast your way through, and then you turn and go up. Yeah, well, that's what Brusilov does. He turns them. But no, Wackerson, yes. I don't think much of Ludendorff.
No.
And I don't think much of his spring offensives, which I thought were how to dissipate your forces, attacking, just instead of concentrating at one point and exploiting that attack.
Yeah, and it wasn't until it was way too late they figured that out.
Yeah.
In 1918, they couldn't follow through on that.
But if they studied Brusilov's offensive, they would have seen it. They see that is how to do it.
Yeah.
But no, it's but the Navy, as I say, is the demand. And I think the naval officers are much better than the Royal Navy. The Royal Navy officers, because the Royal Navy had a serious problem of no initiative. Different from Nelson. Nelson would say to his officers, "Do what you think's right," and they would. By the time we reached 1914, the Royal Navy is that unless the Commander-in-Chief gives you the order, you don't do it. So at Jutland, dreadnoughts can see the German fleet passing them in the distance. Do they tell the Commander-in-Chief? No, because he'll know. We won't disturb him. So there's Jellicoe wondering where the German fleet is, and his own captains are watching it sail past the rear end of their, behind him, and they don't say anything. In one of them case, he could have opened fire on them, and his second in command said, "Shall I?" And he says, "No, we haven't got any orders. We got no orders to open fire, so we won't."
Did they
open fire, that would have given it away.
Wouldn't it? Did they revamp the British Navy after World War I for this, or during?
In the Second World War, many of the officers, the commanders like Somerville and Cunningham, were more aggressive destroyer cruiser commanders of the First World War. So they were like Hoffy. So the Royal Navy regenerated from its more effective element of the First World War. But the senior command, I mean, the opportunities lost at Jutland were almost all because of communication and officer command. Beatty had complete trust in his signals officer, who was really bad. And you put your signal up, just give an order, and then you drop the signal when the order has to be done. So he's put up an order ordering the 5th Squadron, the battle squadron with Warspite and Queen Elizabeth. Well, no, Queen Elizabeth wasn't there. Warspite and so forth, the really big ones, to turn in behind the battle cruisers to follow them down. So the commander of the 5th Battle Squadron sees the flag up, and then he waits for it to drop. And he just carries sailing north, waiting for it to drop. And the signal officer forgot. So the 5th Battle Squadron keeps going north, and then eventually it drops. Then he turns, but now he's way behind the battle cruisers. And so Hipper's only fighting Beatty. He's not fighting the 5th Battle Squadron with their 15-inch guns. That would have been a different matter. But they're way behind. And then Beatty meets the High Seas Fleet. He turns around and says, "Oh my goodness, we've got to get out of here." So he turns north. But does he tell the 5th Battle Squadron? No. So they sail straight into it. And that's when the Warspite gets severely damaged and goes round in circles when rudder gets hit by the... It's only their thick armour that saves the 5th Battle Squadron from the German High Seas Fleet before they get out.
Yeah.
But yes, but I can't see that happening in the Austro-Hungarian Navy.
It's amazing how small things make such a big difference.
I think so, because if you look on paper, that their fleet should be no match for either the Italians, the French, or the British, and yet they keep all 3 navies out of the Adriatic.
Yeah.
I mean, I think I give how big the Italian fleet is in terms of cruisers. I'd say how big the French Navy is in 1914 in the talk. The size of it compared to the Austrian-Hungarians, and yet they can't enter the Adriatic. They held off. They held off by a small protected cruiser.
And the French Navy was, in its design, interesting, at the very least. It was pre-World War One. They built what 5 or 6 capital ships. They were all individually completely different from each other.
Yes, that was up to about 1910, but then they built 14 semi-dreadnoughts, which are good. They had 14 semi-dreadnoughts which carried, and they're different. They did have a powerful fleet in 1914. They had 4 dreadnoughts, the Paris class, and 14 semi-dreadnoughts. So that's a very powerful fleet.
What was so they actually built some that were identical for a change?
Oh yeah, they built a whole class, 2 classes of them. They learned their lesson by about 1905, 1906 of building these floating hotels, they were called.
Yes, that's,
Yes,
I believe, yes.
they learned that didn't work, so they then went for unify like the British, and they built semi-dreadnoughts in that style, carrying 12-inch and 6.4-inch guns, and they built 14 of those.
You mean only 2 types of armor? Only 2 types of weaponry?
Oh yeah, that's a semi-dreadnought.
Yeah.
But it carries medium heavy guns, like heavy cruisers guns. That's 6.47.
I was referring to the floating hotels with all their different.
Oh, the floating. Oh, the hotels. They had 4 12-inch. Some of them had two 12-inch and a 10.8-inch on each side, so they could fire like a diamond. Really strange. So they could fire 3 at broadside, 3 ahead. Except the ones on the side, when they fired ahead, used to damage the ship. So from the blast. So
I think that is fascinating that they did. Was it 6 or 7 completely different? They did of those.
Yeah.
How do you even come up with that harebrained idea?
Well, part of the reason is they took so long to build them. So they order them and then budgets. They delay it. So they would build a ship, and 10 years later it'd be launched. The British would build a dreadnought, and a few months later it'd be launched, whatever it was, like 21 months, I think. So record building. But the British would build 7 pre-dreadnought class of 7, and they'd do it in a couple of years. Well, meanwhile, the French would build this ship, and as it was sitting there being built, each government, because they had a lot of governments, would come up with a new idea. Let's have something else. No, let's have this then. Oh no, maybe we should have this armor. Or so they would keep altering it.
And individually altering it.
Yeah, they kept altering, and then somebody would have an idea like, well, it's a bit cramped, so let's have a big crew. Put the crew upstairs. That's why they were the floating hotels. So most ships, the crew are downstairs, in the hull.
Safety.
And we'll have them up there. That way, we can have more space for armor and guns.
Yeah, that's good for stability too.
The tumble home is to help protection, but it does make the crew space smaller.
Yeah.
So that's why they put it on the top. And it allows our side guns to not damage the ship so much when they fire forward, because there's no deck in the way.
And building up on a ship is great for stability. We all know that.
But the area was part of the reason for the French thing was that they concentrated on commerce raiders. Well, they believed, and it's always regarded as the wrong thing to do, but they were absolutely right. They believed that if you're going to take on the British, you've got to destroy the British economy, not the British Royal Navy, the British economy. What you need are commerce raiders, and that is the only threat to the Royal Navy. And in fact, the only navy in the First World War that threatened the British was the German U-boat service, because the German U-boat is the perfect commerce raider.
Yeah.
It was found by accident. They didn't realize it was going to be. They all thought it'd be a naval weapon, but as a naval weapon, it failed. It's too slow under and too vulnerable on the top and too slow underneath to be any threat to another naval warship. But slow merchant ships, and with radio, you've got to surprise them. So there's nothing as surprising as suddenly having a ship emerge beside you out of the water and point a gun at your bridge and say, stop.
Very true.
Yeah. So, and then if a British destroyers in the area comes rushing, it disappears under the water again, and because it's unsinkable under the water, because there are no depth charges, no means of sinking a submarine underwater, he just made it the perfect commerce raider, and that's what it was.
Yeah.
So, but the Germans had a problem; they didn't build enough.
That's
You've
true.
got 48 U-boats, you can only operate 12 because you've got to have ones going out to sea, some coming back, some in port, some repair. It leaves you about a quarter. So they would only have 12, and that's the 1915-1916 campaign. They only had 12. In the 1917-18 campaign, they only had 48. And the western approaches is 200,000 square miles. 40, yeah. And it just wasn't enough boats. You know, they were sinking this incredible 600,000 tons, but Admiral Sims of the American Navy estimated that if they were going to do what they wanted, they had to sink 2 million tons a month, at least. And they would need about 300 boats out there. Not, well, about that time it was about 50.
Yeah. And that's what they ended up with in World War II, isn't it? About 300.
Yeah. Well, they developed a new tactic in the Second War. There were better boats.
Yes.
And they used Wolfpack.
Yes.
That was thought up by a U-boat captain coming back from Mediterranean in 1918, Karl Donitz. Because the convoy what defeated the U-boat particularly was the convoy. It just emptied the sea. The tactic for the Germans was spread out U-boats, and for low merchantmen that's deadly because you're bound to meet one.
Yeah.
But if you put all 64 ships in one spot, then only one U-boat's going to find it because it's in one spot.
Yeah.
And it might sink one. That means 63 get through.
Yeah. That's true.
Where if there's 64 scattered, they may meet 10, and you lose. So the convoy was what defeated it. The Royal Navy was always convinced the way of defeat was to sink them, but you didn't have to sink them. You had to just stop them operating. Yeah. Well, Donitz came up with the idea of the Wolfpack, which is the one finds the convoy and then calls in all the others, and you concentrate your U-boat fleet on the convoy. And then they become. But that was in his mind on his way home in 1918. And then, of course, he commanded the U-boat service in the Second World War, and he put it into practice, and it was deadly.
In 1918, would he even have had the technology to from one submarine, call others?
Yeah, they did, but not very significant. Nothing compared to. And anyway, we had the equivalent of Enigma. We had Route 40, which was reading all signals. In fact, they were diverting convoys because they were working out where the U-boats were, and they were diverting them as well. Route 40 was telling them. It's one of the you mentioned the Second World. The Second World War tends to hide the First World War, so we tend to see the First World War through the eyes of the Second World War. So everybody thinks that the U-boat service of the First World War was a real threat, as it was in the Second World War, but it wasn't. It was never a threat. Never achieved anything. It was just a very good commerce raider, but it couldn't sink anything like what was required. It sunk, was it 11 million tons, or was it 13 million tons? And no, it's 11 million tons. But by the war's end, we had replaced 9 million of it. With American and Japanese shipbuilding, we had 9 million back. So the actually net was 2 million.
Yeah.
And we weren't stopping. I mean, no American ship was lost transport. Not a single American soldier was lost to a U-boat. We didn't sink a single transport. The logistics supply line from Britain to the Western Front was never cut or even threatened. Didn't lose any of its logistic supplies. I got it. They couldn't close the channel. They could cause panic because it was humiliating for the Royal Navy to not be able to sink them. So they were panicking. Admiral Sims said, "Stop panicking. Why don't you just bring in a convoy?" He thought the British were panicking, and he thought, "What are you panicking for? They're not a threat. They're not a threat. You know, your Grand Fleet has got 100 destroyers protecting it, and not one single ship of the Grand Fleet has been sunk by a U-boat. I should tell you something."
Yeah, that's very true.
I know. So So it wasn't, but we see that, and it's the same with much of it. We tend to see through like a big fog. The Second World War was such a big thing.
Yeah.
We tend to then see the First World War as if we're looking through it and we start to make assumptions about what happened in that war, which really are very, very different from the second.
And you're absolutely right, and that's it. Just needs to be the other way around. You need to see the Second World War in the light of the First World War,
Yes, yeah,
because it came first, and that's where it all began.
yeah.
And that's why I think the First World War is so interesting. That I keep trying to, like I said, I keep trying to take my World War II fans and drag them back to World War One. I've been threatening them for years that I will make them interested in World War One, because you have to start there.
Well, the biggest, I'm writing a book, so I'll probably book here. Biggest difference is that the First World War has 3 fronts, and the third front has been written out of history. It's the economic war, not the naval blockade. There really was no naval blockade. It's an economic war using sanctions, trade embargoes, commercial blackmail against neutral powers, because Germany could not be blockaded while she had neutral neighbors. You could just, and the second largest German port serving Germany wasn't German. It was Dutch. It was Rotterdam, as it is today. Rotterdam supplied the Ruhr, food and everything. And we economically attacked. We used decrees. We used civil servants more than sailors. And it was very successful. So successful that you are talking 1.5 million civilians, mainly children, perishing in the First World War as a result of the Allied economic campaign. Yeah. Germany had already accepted defeat by 1916 and was trying to end the war in 1916, but Wilson screwed it up. But they were determined because they knew they lost. Yeah. What they were trying to do was stop them being destroyed, because they were breaking apart inside. Their population were down to about 1,200 calories a day, which is enough to feed a small child. That is the average. They had practically no lighting, no heating. No, everything was replacement. That's why they had cardboard shoes. They didn't have any leather. No soap. Can you imagine a life without soap? Hygiene, no hygiene. People smelled, and people were so hungry. There was this smell in Germany. You could smell it all the time, and it's corpse. It's cadaver smell. It's when you corpse, you lose fat, and it's the loss of fat. They were losing so much fat that they gave off this awful smell throughout. And Austria-Hungary was worse than Germany.
Yes, they were.
Vienna was down to 800 calories a day on average.
Yeah. And just because the war ended, the embargo, if you will, didn't stop. They didn't start rolling food into Germany until way later. They kept on starting.
Yeah. I'm doing a talk this Saturday. The armistice a war crime, because it isn't. The Germans said it is not an armistice when you say all fighting will finish on the fronts except the third front. We will carry on. Food won the war. Food will won the peace. That was the French attitude. And not a single ton of food was allowed to enter any part of Central Europe, not Germany, any part of Central, including Poland, all through the winter of 1919. It was only at a meeting on March the 8th that the Allies decided to suspend the siege, but only suspend it. They weren't going to remove it altogether, so they wanted to be able to restore it if Germany refused to sign the treaty. And that winter, when I've done the research on that, what happened that winter is absolutely appalling. I couldn't believe it. And it's children. As George Bernard Shaw said, we won the war by starving the children of Germany.
Yeah.
And 𝐬𝐿𝐾𝐿, have you ever heard of 𝐬𝐿𝐾 Jeb?
No.
She and her sister Dorothy Buxton ran a thing called Fight the Famine Council, which was a promote what the British were doing in Germany that winter. And she later, in April 1919, established a charity foundation to save the children of Germany. It's called Save the Children. Really? That's when that charity started, yeah. And it was the children of Central Europe they were trying to stop the starvation of. So, it's a side of the war that, because the Western Front dominates so much, it's a side of the war. And then as soon as the treaty was signed, the Allies, who wrote the history, did not want to admit that. So it was quietly forgotten. For humanity reasons as well. You can't talk to the people who have just lost all their sons and brothers and fathers that on what they thought was a noble war on the Western Front, that in fact it was one elsewhere, and it wasn't quite so noble, and it was by starving people to death.
Yes. I mean, there was not as similar, but there were occurrences after the Second World War to that effect as well in some parts and places, in prisoners of war. That was not so. But it's hard, like you said, it's very hard after you defeated an enemy and you spent 4 or 5 years of telling your population that they're all as bad as Hitler. Then now you need to feed them and take care of them, make sure they don't die, while your own population is. I mean, Britain was under rationing for what years after? It wasn't until 47.
1954.
54. So it's a hard sell. But still, I remember you mentioning the 2 hospital ships. There were torpedoes as well.
Yeah.
That everybody blamed on the Austrians or Germans, but wasn't.
It was the French sunk those 2 hospital ships. They were Austro-Hungarian hospital ships, and the French sank them. One with a mine and one with a torpedo. So but the thing is that what the First World War teaches is that modern warfare is not just about military victories.
No.
It's also about economic power.
Yeah.
And I think that because they wrote it out of the history, that lesson was not learned. And if I quote an example today, America's in a war which has overlooked the economic power of its enemy. So
yeah.
So it's all military power, but military power doesn't necessarily. It's much. There are other weapons, and the British and the Americans used that other weapon in 1917 18 to deadly effect. Absolute. By 1918, neutral Europe was signing agreements with the Allies that handed over total control of their commerce, their shipping, and their trade to Allied supervision. And they're neutral. They were starving. They were forced into it because the Americans were reluctant to get involved in the Third Front because they felt they were the champion of neutral commerce. Yeah. But then the French persuaded them to do so. And then when they got involved, they went further than the British had ever done. They brought in trade embargoes, which literally sealed off the Central Powers from even domestic trade from their neutral neighbors. Denmark was told, if the Danish fishing fleet supplies fish to the Germans, then no gasoline was to be supplied for their boats from America. If Danish pig farmers supply pork to the Germans, no American fodder, which the Danish farmers were deeply dependent on, will be dispatched to Denmark at all. And that just simply, and the neutrals caved in. The Dutch were very resistant, and they ended up being on rationing and semi-starved. But eventually, they eventually capitulated and handed over their entire fleet to the Allies, so trading fleet, merchant fleet. So,
yeah,
it's the power of economic, and then that lesson's lost. I mean, there's a wonderful book called Admiral Concepts wrote a book who's leading in that thing called The Triumph of Unarmed Forces, the role of unarmed forces. This is where sanctions come in, the power of sanctions, and it comes from the First World War. This is where it's developed as a real real weapon of war in the First World War. But then the Western Front loses it, and that lesson isn't learned.
So where are you giving the lecture tomorrow?
Next Saturday. It's in North Wales, on whether the armistice was a war crime. I thought it was a very provocative title, and they loved it. The idea.
Are you recording it and putting it up, or?
No. The Western Front Association does all the YouTube.
Oh, so it's for them. Okay, good.
And I usually do it in York. And York haven't got round to that one yet. They heard me. They talked to Lancaster, that's where I used to be, and they say, "What's he done recently?" And they say, "Oh, the Austro-Hungarian Navy." Oh, we'll have that one. I've
I
done
was
the
asked if
army
I
with them, and I've
that
done
that
the
was one
Royal
of my
Navy.
reasons for joining is do something on some of the World War I forts. And
Well, Western Front does loads of YouTubes,
I know,
massive.
and I've just been so busy doing documentaries, traveling,
Yeah.
filming, working. I haven't actually had time to even write an article, and I kind of feel bad, but I'll get around to it. Get around to it. See if I also the Fortress organization. I'm supposed to write something for them. Um, are you writing any books? Did you write any books?
Well, writing this book, it's taken me
Good.
years. I started researching it 50 years ago because I found the papers of Admiral Richmond in the Greenwich Maritime Library in 1922, and he was talking about a future war with America, how a war between Britain and America could play out. And he decided in 1920 America could never invade Britain and never would want to.
True.
But she wouldn't have to. All she'll have to do is control the trade routes into Britain. The best place would be the Caribbean and off Gibraltar. You could cut Britain off from the rest of the world, and then Britain would collapse economically and surrender. So his argument was that the Royal Navy had to concentrate on protecting the Caribbean and Gibraltar, because Gibraltar's you've got the trade route coming up West Africa, and you've got the one coming out the Med, and the Caribbean is the really vital one because you got it coming up from South America, and Britain at the time was very dependent on South American trade, so that's a key link. And that's what he was saying. And he said, as we did in the First World War. And I thought, what economic war in the First World War? What war? And so I thought, oh. So I went off to the Public Records Office and called up the Admiralty papers on the blockade. So I was thinking of it then. And they took hours to come up because no one had read them for decades. And I found out all this stuff about the 10th Cruiser Squadron and why the 10th Cruiser Squadron, why it was successful, not as a blockading force, but as a blackmailing force, because it was not what it was doing, but it was stopping neutral ships getting around Scotland and sending them in for a week. And when you got narrow shipping profit margins, decreased by high marine insurance because there's a war going on,
Yes.
neutral shipping companies were eager to make deals with the British to have their ships not stopped. So they promised not to carry cargoes that was due to be passed on to the Germans from Copenhagen or Rotterdam or Antwerp, Amsterdam.
Yeah.
So they and that's where the 10th Cruiser and the British said, oh wait a minute, we could blackmail neutral shipping companies. Forget neutral governments. We could blackmail the neutral shipping companies to comply with what we want, which is to stop neutral trade going through neutral countries to the enemy. And then they found better ways, and one of them it was bunker coal, because Britain had a near monopoly of it worldwide. It also had with Lloyd's a complete list of every ship and whatever it did. It also had control of all cables coming out of Europe, so it could decode the commercial messages and find out what ships were doing what and who were breaking the rules, blacklist them and deny them bunker coal.
I mean, this really does explain the case of how the Treaty of Versailles and the end of World War I led directly into World War II. They really left no stone unturned in order for World War II to come round.
No, well, they brutalized an entire generation of teenagers, because the Gauleiters of 1940 are the teenagers of 1916, 1919, who were starving.
Yeah.
And the only way to survive is blow you, I'm all right, Jack. And you steal it.
Yeah.
They lost all social conscience because there's in a famine, there's no social conscience. You just got to fend for yourself.
Yes.
Children were stealing from their parents because they were so hungry in 1918. Juvenile crime went through the roof in Germany. I've got the figures. They went through the roof. And middle class children were doing it, not what traditionally lower class. It was what they said respectable children were going out stealing, sent by their parents to the fields to steal whatever they could get. They were, and because they were starved, the things they were missing were protein and fat, and you need that for development. So they were damaged, particularly mentally damaged. If you starve a teenager, as modern research shows, you mentally damage the brain development. They have less empathy.
Yes.
They have less. So you're creating a brutal population, and now you begin to understand the brutality of the Second World War and the attitude. We created it, and in fact, Lloyd George suggests it. He says in March 1918, there's a viral. We are create if we don't stop this siege and the starvation of the enemy, there's a viral pool developing, and we're going to pay for it at some time. And he was right, but he thought he had nipped it in the bud, but he hadn't.
Has there ever been?
It doesn't mean that the Germans would become that way, but once you get, well, the National Socialists developed that winter. It's the National Socialist Party that develops that winter, because the Bolsheviks, Germany has Bolshevik revolutions because the German government can't feed its population, so the population don't trust it.
Of course.
They turn to the Bolsheviks. The German government, the socialists and the German government, have the army behind them. So they send in the army to put down the order. But the army don't have the men. They've got the officers, but not the men. So they send in the militia. And almost all the leaders of the militia, the Free Corps, are leading members of the Nazi Party. And there was a man called Theodor Abel who wrote a book in 1938. He interviewed 800,000 Nazi members, and the one thing they had in common was they all talked about the Great Famine of 1919. So we created the conditions and the brutality of the Second World War. I mean, that's really what that makes that war so terrible, is the sheer brutality. There's no, First World War began with a certain element of honor, and there's none. There's none, is there? Except the British, who thought there was. But I remember a British officer who said, I thought Germans were still decent until I walked into Belsen.
Which is interesting, because I wonder what the social conscience of Germany was also changed based on not having any of this information. I'm sure this is not a conversation that they have ever had in Germany. All they ever talk about is, Germany has for the past 85 years been defined by the Holocaust, not by what led to that, not what led to that, and not what led to that. There's never been that conversation of what came before that led these events to happen, I don't think. Have you ever had any of this conversation with any of the German historians?
Yeah, I had a German naval officer. I gave a talk on how the 10th Cruiser Squadron won the war, how this blockade worked. And there was a German naval officer his talk was the White Elephant Fleet, which was the high seas fleet. Why it was a waste of time and money. And I asked him that, and he said, "You've got to understand," he said, "that Germans don't want to know history. It's too awful. We want to see the future. We're a people about." So you don't want to get any sense, because they're thinking forward. They want to forget. There's a communal guilt, and they want to forget.
Yeah, like I always said, if you don't know where you're coming from, you don't know where you're going, because you're still anchored in what was. And if you don't understand what that anchor is, you're not moving forward.
Well, it also encourages. I do a talk on the Western Front called on the U-boat war, and I have been accused, I think, in one Western Front of being pro-German. Still this feeling. Well, I was trying to put a balanced view, but when that talk came up, some of the comments came from Germany, and it was like, this is brilliant in the sense that you're putting our side, like the quote of the chief petty officer from a U-boat who explains that they feel guilty about thinking innocent merchantmen, but when they look at their children half starved, living on an onion or whatever, and their pale faces starved, they hate the British for doing this.
Of course.
And, you're doing this to our children. We're going to do it to your merchant ships. So learn, if you're starving, learn what it's like. A lot of the attitude in 1917, the Germans backed the U-boat war, which was a mistake, but they backed it because they said, well, let the British starve. Let them know what it's like. Except the British didn't.
There's that. I mean,
they had more food, they had more calories in 1918 than they had in 1914. 14, 3,500 calories on average compared to 1,000. Yeah, I mean, if the channel was never closed, the French food was crossing over. If you got grain from America, it can go to Cherbourg and then cross the channel. So it didn't matter. The U-boats just, it damaged the economy. It damaged the economy in the long term, but it didn't significantly affect the British war effort in any way, or the British determination to continue.
I have like you in my documentaries and the books I've wrote, I have always tried to be paddling down the middle. I'm not trying to I've never tried to take sides. I've always tried to present what happened. And I go to sometimes great lengths to specifically keep out of the politics. If I talk about a fortress, I want to talk about this fortress. I don't want to talk about the horrible things that may have led up to the existence of the fortress, because it's just the story of that. And I found trying to explain things, I can't remember who said it, but every war is surrounded by a veil of propaganda and lies on all sides. Everybody lies always when it comes to war. Everybody, all the newspapers, the media, the press office, everything is one way or another hyperbole to get your population on board. After this conflict or war ends, it's for the historians to try to sort out what actually happened. Not to point blame, but to try to figure out what actually happened in the middle of the fog of war. And I keep being a little disappointed because I see also recent conflicts. Then you find out 5 years later, well, this is what Tonkin Gulf. Well, we all know Tonkin Gulf didn't really happen. And I'm saying, well, wait a minute, you ended up in a war because of a supposed attack that never happened, because somebody made it up, probably in the CIA, to get it to happen. Shouldn't somebody go to jail for this? 55,000 Americans and God knows how many others died. Shouldn't someone go to jail for this? But nothing ever happens. There's never that sense of, yes, now we know this didn't happen. Shouldn't somebody be blamed officially? Shouldn't somebody rewrite the history books? But it never happens. Historians are never, they're always floating on this stream of whoever won the war, they're sticking to their story for the next 100 years, and you can't rock that boat. And I never understood why.
Well, I think, like with the First War, there's the propaganda. And the historian's got to find the truth behind the propaganda, because the propaganda becomes the history, particularly because it's the propaganda of the victors, and the victors write the history first. I always say whoever writes history first, it has to be disproved, which means they own the truth.
Yes.
So the Allies win, they admit in 1919 that it is the Third Front that won the war. And then they change, because the propaganda of the war would suggest that the Western Front, Foch, who is so instrumental in maintaining the siege during the winter of 1919, makes no mention. It's all about how brave the French were on the Western Front. It's a brave army, won the war. And that's the propaganda. That's got to fit. The Italians fought their war for democracy. There's the big headlines. This is for democracy. And they got Mussolini. But then, so it is about that. So it's the propaganda, and it then shapes the history. And then what the historian's got to do is sort out from the propaganda and the reality. Germany. I've even seen a recent 2014. I saw a respectable BBC program started by saying Germany invaded Belgium because it wanted to conquer Europe. But that's the propaganda. But the Germans never wanted to conquer Europe. I mean, some of their right-wing military might have thought it'd be really good to extend the empire, but that was not what they were out. They were out to, I don't know what they were. I think they entered a war which they didn't really know where it was going.
I don't think it was a long-term plan on that particular part.
Yeah, they were with the Russians. When they said to the Russians, "We'll go to war if you mobilize," and the Tsar says, "Can we half mobilize?" and the Russian army says no. So they mobilize, but Germany automatically declares war. Then the Kaiser realizes that, and according to one account he writes he sends a message to his cousin Dick saying, "We don't mean it. Can you get out of this?" And the Tsar says, "Oh, great. Get hold of the French," tells the war minister, "Get hold of the German ambassador and say, we will talk." So he rings up the German ambassador at the embassy, and he gets a civil servant who says, "I'm sorry, we can't answer that. You have to talk to the American consul. We're at war and we no longer represent Germany." So that one last minute chance.
It was like when the Kaiser he asked when the Kaiser asked Moltke if why are we mobilizing against France when the Russians are mobilizing against us? Shouldn't we go east? And Moltke said, "No, we can't do that because all the plans are laid for going west."
Oh, he admitted later that he just couldn't be bothered to change. He could have changed, but he apparently cried when the Kaiser did that.
Other examples of how things have been slow to be rewritten is, of course, World War II on the Eastern Front, because for decades, Western historians were only pretty much privy to whatever information the Russians gave them. And then for the past 10, 20 years, after the Cold War ended, slowly it's beginning to come out from the archives, and the Russians are still keeping this shut. But ever since Viktor Suvorov, he wrote about it, more people have been digging into the fact, well, Stalin was sort of on his way to attack Germany in July of 41. And there's more and more indications of this, to the point where I'm ready to say, well, maybe we should start to revisit why Hitler attacked when he did. Because everybody said he wasn't ready. He shouldn't have done it. It wasn't logistical ready. It was bad timing, unprepared, all this stuff. And the only reason for that makes sense if it actually was that he saw, well, the Russians are coming. Whoever jumps off first is going to have the advantage. We no longer have a choice. We have to go now. That explains it. It explains why the enormous troop buildup and logistical buildup right on the demarcation front. The Germans took thousands of train cars, tanks on the trains, rails, planes on the ground, all of this way up on the western frontier. And if you look into this, it certainly looks like that is what was about to happen. And that makes all the pieces on the Eastern Front fall into place. But of course, we're still waiting. Hopefully, maybe the Russians will release those files in our lifetime.
Although I think it was partly Hitler. I mean, he wanted to attack France in October 1939, but his generals said, "We're not ready."
Yeah.
But he said, "I'm ready."
Yeah.
And I think quite possibly the Wehrmacht wasn't wanting to go to attack Russia, but he was. I mean, that was his object in the first place.
I mean,
France
it was going to come down.
Britain was a diversion. And Mussolini caused the diversion and delayed the attack by 3 months, wasn't it? Because the German army had to go and arrest Mussolini. There are articles I've read that says Mussolini helped win the war by delaying the Operation Barbarossa it was too late in the year.
I mean, there's also the problem is it's the rainy season in the spring in the east, so it wouldn't be a good time to jump off anyway. I mean, I don't think there's any doubt that that Stalin and Hitler was going to get into it one way or another. And I think there's every reason to think that Stalin was going to attack West just as well, if you look at the buildup of his forces. And it came down to the race of who was going to do it first.
Well, I think the Russians were expecting, felt that Hitler would, that the French and the British would waste the German army, making it easier to come in from the east. I think he was taken with surprise by the collapse of France. I mean, on paper, France looked quite capable of creating another great wall, trenches, and but yeah, I think he was, as an opportunist, was seeing that let the Germans battle themselves with the West, and then we can take them from the East.
That's all the indications I see as well. And I go back to the French then. Yes, they had great soldiers, but the leadership, problematic.
Yeah, I think my father gave me a book by a French general. I've forgotten his name now, but in it he describes it's the story of 1940, and he says 𝐬𝐵𝐺. This is what my father thought was so shocking. 𝐬𝐵𝐺 has no guts. General 𝐬𝐵𝐺 has no guts. The French generals were the First World War traumatized them, and they hadn't got new generals. They were using First World War generals, 𝐬𝐵𝐺, Gamelin, and they had what's his name, Petain,
Petain.
And they were a generation behind, where the Germans were using a whole new group of officers.
Yeah. And of course, the French didn't trust their army or their officer corps either.
No.
And that was also relying on reservists instead of having a standing army because they didn't trust it. And the French.
Oh, sorry, go on.
No. I was going to say, it's not like they didn't change. About 26 changes of government in the interwar years.
Yeah.
They had problems in France. What were you saying?
I was going to say, you mentioned about Belgium, and I suddenly remember the fact that before the First World War, the French plan, which they abandoned in 1911, was to put the French army on the Belgian border because they expect the Germans through.
Yes.
But it was felt to be a defensive plan, which was not in the spirit of a French army.
Elan.
So Joffre's plan was to do this attack, and they assumed that the German movement through Belgium, which they expected, wouldn't be that strong.
And
anyway, they would win.
Yeah, of
on
course.
The Rhine. They would be in Germany by the time the Germans reached France. They were, but they weren't, because they were completely stopped at the Meuse.
Yeah. Why would the Germans go through Sedan again?
Yeah. Well, to some extent, that's where the Marne went. That was the second breaking of this. First breaking of the Schlieffen plan was not going through Holland. That was because they didn't want the Dutch. They wanted the Dutch to be neutral because they know that Rotterdam, to use Moltke's words, is the windpipe of Germany.
Yes.
So if you make Holland a belligerent, you lose Rotterdam, and they knew they needed Rotterdam to remain neutral. So that meant they had to concentrate through that narrow corridor into Belgium, which reduced the size of the attack and delayed the logistic supply line, because the movement through Holland was to create a supply line through the railways of Limburg to allow the movement quicker through Belgium. But now it was the logistics was restricted.
Yeah.
And then the second was that they realized that they forgot Paris because they had a chance to do another Sedan by surrounding. They'd already started to surround the French army on the Meuse, near Verdun, and now they could do it coming the other way. And so they made that shift.
Yeah.
And opened up the gap, which the Royal Flying Corps spotted. Royal Flying Corps, it spotted it. There was two pilots that spotted the opening up of the gap between the First and the Second Army, and reported it. And so air power, you see, where it's really useful.
It was. But
that's one of the reasons why cavalry wasn't machine guns that brought cavalry. It was the fact that every offensive would be followed by a large cavalry attack to break through. Cavalry create enormous amount of dust.
Yes.
And easily seen from the air. So any enemy aircraft spots a large concentration of cavalry in any sector, it knows that's where the offensive's going through.
Yeah.
So you then send your troops ready for the counterattack. So cavalry was a dead giveaway from the air, where of course without aircraft you can't see them. So it made cavalry a liability.
Plus, horses needs to rest, and you can't feed them gasoline, which is a problem.
Yeah. But it's harder to hide large amounts of cavalry from the air. But yeah, what I like is that the first thing that the Royal Flying Corps did for the British Army was at the Mons, where they found the French army for them. It wasn't the German army, which was massing in front of them. It was the French army, because they didn't know where the French Fifth Army had gone. And it was the pilots reported that the French Fifth Army was in full retreat, and that the British were now left on their own and were about to be surrounded. So the British then hail-tailed out of Mons. But if the Royal Flying Corps hadn't spotted that, they would have been surrounded.
Yeah. So the French in communication, seriously.
Oh well, they couldn't be bothered with the British. It was just a little tiny little force on the edge of the great French army. It wasn't even, it was just a couple of divisions. It wasn't even an army corps. Why would you want to tell the British that?
No, call them later. Oh, send them a letter.
I don't think Haig ever realised the contempt that the French had for the British Army. They used it, and they used the British Army like the Somme. The whole point of the Somme offensive is to support the French at Verdun, but it's not an offensive that would be in the interest of the British. That would have been at Lille, where the railway hub is.
Yeah, of course.
And that's where Haig wanted it, but he had to move it to the marshes of the Somme, which is probably the worst place to launch an offensive into.
Yeah.
They get uphill because the Germans have taken all the high ground. The Western Front is not random. The Germans took the high ground. The French and British always charging uphill.
Yeah.
They took the high ground, and behind that high ground is the railways, so that they can move troops up and down the front. It was a beautifully constructed defensive line that they produced.
Lots of cement. Lots of bunkers.
Making it very difficult for, and then they held it defensively. What was it? On to 1918. I thought it's not an offensive line. The fences are east.
And it's certainly not an offensive line.
But yeah, so I mean, he listened to the French. We always listened to the French in the First World War, and I think to our great cost.
Yeah, you're not wrong on that. That's very true. But all right, I'm going to let you go.
I'm sorry. I'm
2 hours later.
How do we get on to Mons? I don't know.
Well, we started with some wet business. I think we need to have a chat on the Austrian army at some point. Yeah, but I'll let you get through next weekend.
Well, it was nice to have a talk. I've thoroughly enjoyed myself.
Yeah.
Okay, I'll let you go.
All right. I will see you again. We got to do this again. I'm sure we can come up with something.
Hope you'll consider subscribing to my channel, liking, follows, and maybe even join me on Patreon to help out. I am just a guy, a historian, traveling around all these historic places in Europe on my own dime, trying to bring them to you.